Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight, we venture into one of the most deeply disturbing chapters in modern true crime, a story that challenges our understanding of family, manipulation, and the devastating consequences of unchecked power dynamics. This is not just a tale of crime, but a profound tragedy that began with what should have been a moment of joy, a young woman's reunion with her biological parents. The story of Katie and Stephen Plattell is one that tests the boundaries of comprehension. It's a narrative that begins with hope, the hope of a young woman searching for her roots, seeking connection with the family that gave her life. But it transforms into something far darker, revealing how manipulation can masquerade as love, how power can corrupt the most fundamental of human bonds, and how tragedy can emerge from the places we least expect it. As we unfold this story together, we'll explore not just the events that transpired, but the complex psychological forces that allowed such a tragedy to occur. We'll examine how a reunion meant to heal old wounds instead opened new ones, and how the search for family connection became a pathway to devastating loss. So before we begin, I want you to get comfortable whether you're listening to fall asleep or just to unwind, as we dive into this mystery of misplaced trust, manipulation, and ultimately, the terrible price paid by innocent lives caught in the web of someone else's darkness. Our story begins in 1995, in a world that feels both familiar and distant from our own. The internet was still new, chat rooms were novel spaces where strangers could meet across vast distances, and a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Garcia was about to make a connection that would change the trajectory of multiple lives forever. Alyssa was a teenager navigating the complex world of adolescence when she encountered Stephen Plattell in an online chat room. Stephen was 20 years old, 5 years her senior, a gap that might seem small in adult years but represents a vast difference in life experience and emotional development when one person is still in the formative years of adolescence. Stephen, at 20, convinced 15-year-old Alyssa Garcia to flee her family home and live with him in New York after meeting her through an online chat room. This wasn't a gradual courtship or a relationship that developed over time with proper boundaries and parental awareness. This was a young girl being convinced by an older man to leave everything she knew and trusted behind. The relationship between Stephen and Alyssa was problematic from the beginning, built on an inherent power imbalance that favored someone who was legally an adult over someone who was still a minor. When Alyssa became pregnant at such a young age, she faced the kind of life-altering decision that no teenager should have to make alone. The pregnancy brought with it all the complexities that arise when young people who are barely equipped to care for themselves are suddenly faced with the responsibility of caring for another life. Alyssa was still a teenager herself, still developing her own sense of identity and place in the world, when she found herself preparing to become a mother. The decision to place the baby for adoption is one that countless young parents have made throughout history, often with tremendous heartache but also with the recognition that it represents the most loving choice they can make under difficult circumstances. For Alyssa, the decision to give up her daughter Katie for adoption wasn't made lightly, it was made with the hope that her child would have opportunities and stability that she, as a teenage mother, might not be able to provide. Katie was placed with a loving adoptive family who welcomed her with open arms and provided her with the stable, nurturing environment that every child deserves. Her adoptive parents gave her not just a home, but a foundation of love and support that would carry her through her childhood and into young adulthood. For Alyssa, the decision to place Katie for adoption represented both an ending and a beginning. It was the end of one chapter of her life, her relationship with Stephen, her role as Katie's primary caretaker, but it was also the beginning of her journey toward building a more stable life for herself. She eventually married and had other children, creating the family stability that had been absent during her tumultuous teenage years. Stephen Plattell, meanwhile, seemed to move on with his life as well. He married Alyssa, and together they built what appeared to be a conventional family life. They had 2 more children together, creating a household that from the outside looked like many others in their community. But beneath the surface of this apparent normalcy, there were undercurrents that would later prove significant. Stephen was someone who had demonstrated a pattern of seeking control over younger, more vulnerable individuals. His initial relationship with Alyssa when she was just 15 revealed something about his character: a willingness to pursue relationships with significant power imbalances, a tendency to convince others to abandon their support systems, and a comfort with relationships that others might find inappropriate. These early patterns would prove to be more than just youthful indiscretions. They were indicators of a personality that was drawn to control, manipulation, and the exploitation of power differences, characteristics that would later have devastating consequences for everyone involved. As Katie grew up in her adoptive family, unaware of the complex circumstances surrounding her birth, Stephen continued his life, apparently settled into marriage and fatherhood. But the seeds of future tragedy were already planted in the patterns of behavior he had established, waiting for the right circumstances to grow into something far more dangerous. The stage was set for a reunion that should have been joyful but would instead become the catalyst for one of the most disturbing family tragedies in recent memory. While Stephen Plattell was building his life with Alyssa and their subsequent children, Katie was growing up in an entirely different world, one filled with the love and stability of her adoptive family. Her adoptive parents provided her with something invaluable: a normal childhood, free from the dysfunction and instability that had characterized her biological parents' early relationship. Katie's adoptive family gave her more than just a home; they gave her a foundation of security that allowed her to develop into a confident, curious young woman. She attended school, made friends, participated in activities, and experienced all the milestones of a typical American childhood. Her adoptive parents were not just caretakers, they were her true parents in every way that mattered, providing the guidance, support, and unconditional love that every child needs. As Katie moved through her teenage years, she began to experience something that many adopted children face: curiosity about her biological origins. This curiosity wasn't a rejection of her adoptive family or an indication that she felt unloved or incomplete. Rather, it was a natural human desire to understand her own story, to know where she came from, and to potentially connect with the people who had given her life. The questions that adoptees often ask themselves began to surface in Katie's mind. Who were her biological parents? What did they look like? Did she have any biological siblings? Were there medical histories she should know about? What circumstances led to her adoption? These questions weren't born from dissatisfaction with her current life, but from a desire to understand the complete picture of her identity. Her adoptive parents, understanding and supportive as they had always been, recognized that Katie's curiosity about her biological family was natural and healthy. They had always been open about her adoption, never treating it as a secret to be hidden or a source of shame. When Katie expressed interest in learning more about her biological family, they supported her desire to explore those connections. Meanwhile, Stephen Plattell's life was continuing on what appeared to be a normal trajectory. He and Alyssa were raising their family together, dealing with the everyday challenges and joys of parenthood. But those who knew Stephen well might have noticed certain characteristics that set him apart from other fathers and husbands. Stephen exhibited traits that would later prove significant: a need for control within his household, expectations of compliance from family members, and a tendency to make decisions that prioritized his own desires over the needs or comfort of others. These weren't necessarily obvious red flags at the time; many people have controlling tendencies without them escalating to dangerous levels, but they were part of a pattern that would become more pronounced as circumstances changed. The marriage between Stephen and Alyssa faced the typical stresses that many marriages encounter: financial pressures, parenting challenges, the gradual evolution of two people who had gotten together when they were very young. But there were also deeper issues at play, issues rooted in the fundamental power imbalance that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Alyssa had been so young when she first met Stephen, so dependent on him for support and direction, that she had never really had the opportunity to develop her own independent identity. As she matured into full adulthood, she began to recognize the ways in which her relationship with Stephen had been shaped by dynamics that weren't entirely healthy. The process of personal growth and self-awareness that occurs throughout our 20s and 30s began to reveal to Alyssa the extent to which her early relationship with Stephen had been problematic. She started to understand that what had seemed like love and protection when she was a vulnerable teenager might have actually been manipulation and control. As Katie approached her 18th birthday, the legal barriers that had separated her from information about her biological family began to dissolve. At 18, she would have the legal right to seek information about her birth parents, to potentially make contact if she chose to do so. This approaching milestone represented different things to different people. For Katie, it represented the possibility of answers to questions she had carried for years. For her adoptive parents, it represented a potential expansion of their daughter's understanding of herself, which they supported even though it might be emotionally complex. For Stephen Plattel, though he didn't yet know it, Katie's approaching 18th birthday represented the beginning of a series of events that would ultimately destroy multiple lives and reveal the true extent of his capacity for manipulation, control, and violence. The paths of Katie and Stephen were about to converge after 18 years of separation, and what should have been a joyful reunion would instead become the catalyst for one of the most tragic family stories in recent memory. Katie Plattel met her birth parents when she turned 18, and what began as a moment that should have been filled with joy and connection quickly revealed itself to be something far more complex and ultimately dangerous. The initial contact between Katie and her biological family likely followed patterns that are common in many adoption reunions. There would have been phone calls, perhaps emails, the sharing of photographs and stories about the years that had passed. For Katie, these early communications represented the fulfillment of years of curiosity about her origins. Stephen and Alyssa Plattel would have shared stories about their lives, their other children, Katie's biological half-siblings, and perhaps their memories of the difficult decision to place Katie for adoption so many years earlier. For any normal family, this would have been a time of healing, of building new relationships while respecting the boundaries that had been established over 18 years of separation. But this reunion was not unfolding in a normal family dynamic. Stephen Plattel was not approaching this reconnection with his biological daughter as a healthy father figure seeking to build an appropriate relationship with an adult child he had never known. Instead, he seems to have seen Katie's entry into his life as an opportunity for something entirely different, and entirely inappropriate. The reunion progressed from initial contact to in-person meetings, and eventually to Katie spending extended time with her biological family. This progression might have seemed natural to everyone involved, including Katie herself. After 18 years of wondering about her biological family, the opportunity to spend time with them, to get to know her half-siblings, and to understand her origins would have felt like a dream come true. But Stephen was not content with a normal father-daughter relationship. Almost immediately, he began treating Katie differently than he treated his other children. While his behavior toward his other children followed typical parental patterns, his interactions with Katie took on characteristics that were more similar to romantic pursuit than paternal bonding. Stephen began spending excessive amounts of one-on-one time with Katie, isolating her from other family members and from her adoptive family. He showed her attention that was intense and focused in ways that were inappropriate for a father-daughter relationship. He began to position himself not as a parental figure, but as someone who was uniquely capable of understanding and caring for Katie. The psychological manipulation that Stephen employed was sophisticated and deliberate. He likely told Katie that their connection was special, that she was different from his other children, that their relationship transcended normal family boundaries. He may have convinced her that the intensity of their connection was natural given the years they had been separated, that the unusual nature of their relationship was simply a reflection of the unique circumstances of their reunion. Katie, at 18, was in a vulnerable position that Stephen exploited ruthlessly. She was seeking connection with her biological family, hoping to understand her origins and find her place in the world. She had no experience with manipulation of this nature, no framework for recognizing that what Stephen was presenting as special love was actually predatory behavior. The isolation that Stephen created around Katie served multiple purposes. It separated her from people who might have recognized the inappropriate nature of their relationship and intervened. It made her more dependent on Stephen's version of reality, more susceptible to his explanations of why their relationship was acceptable. And it created an environment where Stephen's behavior could escalate without outside scrutiny. During this period, Stephen's marriage to Alyssa began to deteriorate rapidly. Alyssa was watching her husband develop an inappropriate fixation on their biological daughter, and she began to recognize the patterns of behavior that had characterized her own early relationship with Stephen. The man who had pursued her when she was just 15 was now directing that same inappropriate attention toward Katie. Alyssa found herself in an impossibly difficult position. She was watching Stephen repeat the same patterns of manipulation and control that had shaped her own youth, but this time the target was their biological daughter. She recognized the danger that Katie was in, but she also understood that Katie was now legally an adult and might not be receptive to warnings about Stephen's true nature. The household became increasingly tense as Stephen devoted more and more of his attention to Katie while neglecting his responsibilities to his wife and other children. The other children in the home were witnessing their father's inappropriate behavior toward their half-sister, creating a family dynamic that was confusing, disturbing, and deeply damaging to their emotional development. What should have been a joyful expansion of the family circle was instead tearing the family apart, creating divisions and tensions that would have lasting impacts on everyone involved. But Stephen seemed oblivious to, or unconcerned about, the damage he was causing to his existing family relationships. His focus was entirely on Katie, and his intentions were becoming increasingly clear to everyone except Katie herself. The reunion that had begun with such hope was transforming into something dark and twisted, setting the stage for even greater tragedy to come. The relationship between Stephen and Katie continued to escalate in ways that violated every natural boundary that should exist between a father and daughter. What Stephen was doing wasn't simply inappropriate parenting or overly intense bonding, it was a calculated campaign of grooming and manipulation directed at his own biological child. Stephen began to blur the lines between his role as Katie's father and something else entirely. He started treating Katie less like a daughter and more like a romantic partner. He would spend hours alone with her, take her on outings that resembled dates more than father-daughter activities, and create situations where physical boundaries became increasingly inappropriate. The psychological manipulation that Stephen employed was both sophisticated and predatory. He likely convinced Katie that their intense connection was special, that it transcended normal family relationships because of the unique circumstances of their reunion. He may have told her that the feelings developing between them were natural, even inevitable, given the years they had been separated and the intensity of finally finding each other. Katie, still a teenager despite being legally an adult, had no framework for understanding what was happening to her. She had come into this reunion seeking a father figure, someone who could provide the paternal connection she had never experienced. Instead, she was being manipulated by someone who was exploiting her vulnerability and her desire for family connection. The grooming process that Stephen employed followed patterns that are tragically common in cases of familial abuse. He isolated Katie from potential sources of support and alternative perspectives. He created a sense of specialness and uniqueness around their relationship. He gradually normalized behaviors that should have been recognized as inappropriate. And he positioned himself as the only person who truly understood and cared for Katie. As Stephen's behavior toward Katie became increasingly inappropriate, the rest of the family was forced to confront a reality that was almost too disturbing to acknowledge. Alyssa was watching her husband pursue their biological daughter in ways that mirrored his pursuit of her when she had been a vulnerable teenager. The other children in the household were witnessing behavior that was confusing and deeply inappropriate. Alyssa found herself facing an impossible situation. She recognized the danger that Katie was in, but she also understood that Katie was now legally an adult and had been effectively manipulated into believing that Stephen's behavior was appropriate. Any attempt to intervene might be dismissed by Katie as jealousy or misunderstanding. The marriage between Stephen and Alyssa reached a breaking point as Stephen's obsession with Katie consumed more and more of his attention and energy. Alyssa made the difficult but necessary decision to separate from Stephen, taking their other children with her. This decision represented both an attempt to protect her other children from witnessing further inappropriate behavior and a recognition that her marriage had become irreparably damaged. Stephen's response to Alyssa's decision to leave revealed the true nature of his character. Rather than recognizing that his behavior had been inappropriate and working to rebuild his family relationships, he saw Alyssa's departure as an opportunity to pursue his relationship with Katie more openly. With Alyssa and the other children out of the house, Stephen no longer had to maintain even the pretense of appropriate father-daughter behavior. The relationship between Stephen and Katie crossed the final line when it became sexual. This wasn't a consensual adult relationship. This was a father exploiting his biological daughter, someone who was emotionally vulnerable and had been systematically manipulated over a period of months. The sexual relationship between Stephen and Katie represented the ultimate violation of the trust that should exist between a parent and child. It was the culmination of months of grooming, manipulation, and exploitation. Katie, who had entered this reunion seeking a father figure and family connection, had instead become the victim of one of the most profound forms of abuse imaginable. The psychological damage that this relationship inflicted on Katie cannot be overstated. She had been manipulated into believing that this relationship was appropriate, even special. She had been isolated from sources of support that might have helped her recognize the true nature of what was happening. And she had been exploited by someone who should have been protecting her. The father and daughter married and had a son, which represented an even deeper level of violation and manipulation. Stephen had convinced Katie not only to engage in an inappropriate sexual relationship, but to formalize that relationship through marriage and to bring a child into the situation. The birth of a child from this relationship added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating situation. An innocent child was now part of a family dynamic that was fundamentally unhealthy and inappropriate. The child would grow up in an environment where the most basic boundaries of family relationships had been violated. As news of the relationship became public, the legal system was forced to confront a situation that challenged conventional frameworks for understanding family relationships and abuse. Stephen and Katie were both adults when their sexual relationship began, but the power dynamics and manipulation involved made it clear that this was not a consensual relationship between equals. The relationship between Stephen and Katie Plattell could not remain hidden indefinitely. When news of their marriage and the birth of their child became public, it sent shockwaves through their community and eventually captured national attention as one of the most disturbing family stories in recent memory. In February 2018, a disturbing headline appeared on CBS News: Nightdale man impregnates biological daughter, plans to marry her, warrants say. The headline, stark and uncompromising, revealed to the world a situation that challenged basic assumptions about family relationships and human behavior. The legal system was faced with the complex task of determining how to address a situation that was clearly wrong but didn't fit neatly into existing legal categories. In January 2018, Katie and Stephen were arrested on incest charges, marking the beginning of a legal process that would attempt to hold them accountable for their actions while also recognizing the complex power dynamics that had led to this situation. The charges they faced were serious. Stephen and Katie were each facing a potential 10-year prison sentence if convicted of felony incest. But the legal case also raised difficult questions about culpability, consent, and the extent to which Katie should be held responsible for a relationship that had been initiated through manipulation and grooming. Stephen's attorney attempted to frame the relationship as consensual, emphasizing that Katie was an 18-year-old woman when the relationship began. This defense strategy revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the power dynamics involved in familial abuse and the ways in which age of consent laws don't necessarily address the complexities of relationships involving significant power imbalances and psychological manipulation. The legal system's response to the case revealed some of the challenges involved in addressing familial abuse cases where the victim has reached the age of legal adulthood. While Katie was legally an adult when the sexual relationship began, she had been subjected to months of grooming and manipulation that had compromised her ability to make truly free and informed decisions about the relationship. Stephen and Katie were also charged with 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, suggesting that their relationship had also had negative impacts on other children in the household. The other children in Stephen's family had been forced to witness inappropriate behavior and had been exposed to family dynamics that were confusing and potentially traumatic. As the legal case proceeded, more details about the relationship began to emerge. The public learned about the manipulation and grooming that had preceded the sexual relationship, the isolation of Katie from potential sources of support, and the devastating impact on the rest of the family. What had initially appeared to some as a consensual adult relationship was revealed to be a carefully orchestrated campaign of abuse and manipulation. The case also highlighted broader issues about adoption reunions and the potential risks involved when biological parents reconnect with children they placed for adoption years earlier. While the vast majority of adoption reunions are positive experiences that enrich the lives of everyone involved, the Plattle case demonstrated how these reunions could potentially be exploited by individuals with manipulative or predatory tendencies. Katie's adoptive family found themselves in an incredibly difficult position. They had supported Katie's desire to connect with her biological family, never imagining that the reunion would lead to such devastating consequences. They were now watching someone they had raised and loved become the victim of manipulation and abuse by someone who should have been protecting her. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that Katie had been manipulated into believing that her relationship with Stephen was appropriate. She may have genuinely believed that she was in love with Stephen, that their relationship was special and meaningful. The psychological manipulation she had endured made it difficult for her to recognize the true nature of what had happened to her. As the case moved through the legal system, it became clear that this was not just a legal matter but also a profound human tragedy. Multiple lives had been damaged or destroyed by Stephen's actions. His marriage to Alyssa had been destroyed. His relationship with his other children had been irreparably damaged. Katie had been robbed of the opportunity to develop a healthy relationship with her biological family. And an innocent child had been brought into a situation that was fundamentally unhealthy. The legal system was attempting to address a situation that went far beyond simple criminal behavior. This was a case that involved the destruction of multiple family relationships, the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, and the violation of some of the most fundamental taboos in human society. But even as the legal system worked to address the consequences of Stephen's actions, the worst was yet to come. As the legal case against Stephen and Katie Plattle proceeded, the court system imposed conditions that were designed to protect all parties involved while ensuring that justice could be served. These conditions included restrictions on contact between Stephen and Katie, requirements for supervised visitation with their child, and other measures intended to prevent further inappropriate behavior. For Stephen, these legal restrictions represented a fundamental challenge to the control he had established over Katie. Throughout their relationship, he had been able to manipulate her environment, isolate her from outside influences, and maintain absolute control over their interactions. The legal system's intervention threatened to break that control and potentially expose Katie to perspectives that might help her recognize the true nature of their relationship. The separation imposed by the legal system began to have an effect on Katie that Stephen had not anticipated. Away from his constant manipulation and influence, Katie began to gain some clarity about her situation. She started to recognize that the relationship she had been convinced was special and appropriate was actually something far more troubling. Katie made the difficult but crucial decision to try to extract herself from the relationship with Stephen. This decision represented an enormous act of courage, given the psychological manipulation she had endured and the way her reality had been distorted over the course of their relationship. She began to understand that what Stephen had presented as love was actually a form of abuse. For Stephen, Katie's decision to distance herself from him represented an intolerable loss of control. He had invested tremendous energy in manipulating Katie into the relationship, had destroyed his marriage and family relationships in the process, and had built his entire emotional world around his ability to control and possess her. The prospect of losing that control triggered a response that was both predictable and terrifying. Stephen's reaction to Katie's attempts to separate from him revealed the true extent of his narcissism and his inability to accept that other people had the right to make decisions about their own lives. Rather than recognizing that Katie's decision was a healthy step toward recovering from the abuse she had suffered, Stephen saw it as a betrayal that deserved punishment. The psychological profile that emerges from Stephen's behavior is that of someone who was incapable of seeing other people as independent individuals with their own rights and desires. Katie, in his mind, existed primarily as an extension of his own needs and desires. When she attempted to assert her independence and make decisions about her own life, Stephen saw this as a fundamental violation of what he believed to be the natural order of their relationship. Stephen's escalating anger and desperation as he lost control over Katie became increasingly dangerous. He began making threats, both explicit and implicit, about what would happen if Katie continued to distance herself from him. These threats revealed that Stephen was not just manipulative and controlling, but potentially violent when his control was challenged. The legal system and Katie's support network recognized that Stephen posed a significant threat to Katie's safety. Protective measures were put in place to try to keep Stephen away from Katie and to ensure that he could not harm her in retaliation for her decision to leave the relationship. But Stephen was not content to simply accept the end of the relationship and move on with his life. Instead, he began planning something that would ensure that if he could not possess Katie, no one else could either. His thinking had become completely distorted by his narcissism and his inability to accept that Katie had the right to make her own decisions about her life. The child that Stephen and Katie had brought into their inappropriate relationship became another focal point of Stephen's obsession with control. The child represented not just a connection to Katie, but also a symbol of the relationship that Stephen refused to let go of. In Stephen's distorted thinking, the child belonged to him in the same way that Katie belonged to him. As Stephen's mental state continued to deteriorate, those around him began to recognize that he was capable of extreme violence. The combination of his narcissistic personality, his history of manipulation and control, and his complete inability to accept the loss of his relationship with Katie created a psychological powder keg that was ready to explode. The tragedy that was about to unfold would demonstrate the ultimate consequence of Stephen's inability to see other people as independent individuals deserving of respect and autonomy. When control and manipulation failed to achieve his goals, Stephen would resort to the ultimate form of control, violence. April 12, 2018, began like any other day for Katie Platel, but it would end in tragedy that would shock the nation and demonstrate the ultimate consequences of Stephen's psychological manipulation and need for control. Stephen Walter Platel, accused of impregnating his biological daughter, killed her, their son, and her adoptive father before he killed himself on Thursday. The events of that day unfolded across multiple states, revealing the extent of Stephen's planning and the depth of his determination to maintain control over Katie and their child, even if it meant destroying them. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or temporary insanity, it was a carefully planned act of violence designed to ensure that if Stephen couldn't possess Katie and their child, no one could. Stephen's first victim was his own infant son, Bennett, who had been living with Stephen following the separation. The murder of his own child revealed the complete absence of normal human empathy or paternal instinct in Stephen's psychological makeup. The child, innocent of any wrongdoing, became a victim of his father's twisted need for control and revenge. Authorities believe Stephen killed his son before driving to Connecticut to kill Katie. The sequence of events demonstrates that Stephen's actions were not impulsive reactions to immediate circumstances, but rather the implementation of a plan that had been developed over time as his control over Katie slipped away. After killing his son in North Carolina, Stephen drove to Connecticut, where Katie was staying with her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco. Katie had returned to the safety of her adoptive family, seeking refuge from the manipulation and abuse she had endured. Her adoptive father, who had supported her throughout her life, was providing her with the protection and support she needed to recover from her traumatic experience. When they arrived, they found Katie Platel and her adoptive father shot to death in a pickup truck. The scene that law enforcement discovered was one of profound tragedy, a young woman who had been seeking to rebuild her life and the father who had been trying to protect her, both killed by someone who claimed to love Katie but was actually incapable of anything approaching genuine love or care. The murder of Anthony Fusco was particularly tragic because it demonstrated Stephen's complete disregard for the impact of his actions on innocent people. Anthony Fusco had done nothing more than provide love and support to his adoptive daughter, but in Stephen's distorted worldview, anyone who supported Katie's independence from him was a legitimate target for violence. Over the course of the day, Stephen Plattel was also found. Police confirmed he had killed himself in his car after driving into New York. Stephen's suicide was the final act of his campaign of control and destruction. Having killed everyone who he believed stood between him and his possession of Katie, Stephen took his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. The murder-suicide that Stephen committed represented the ultimate expression of his psychological pathology. When manipulation and emotional abuse failed to maintain his control over Katie, when the legal system imposed restrictions on his behavior, when Katie began to assert her independence and seek help from her support network, Stephen's response was to destroy everyone and everything rather than accept that he had no right to control another person's life. The tragedy revealed the true nature of what Stephen had presented as love for Katie. Genuine love involves respect for the other person's autonomy, support for their growth and independence, and concern for their well-being. Stephen's behavior demonstrated none of these characteristics. Instead, it revealed a possessive, controlling, and ultimately violent obsession that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with his own narcissistic needs. The 4 deaths that resulted from Stephen's actions, his infant son, Katie, her adoptive father, and himself, represented the complete destruction of multiple families and the devastating consequences of unchecked manipulation and abuse. We're trying to make sense of all the factors that led up to this senseless taking of innocent lives, as one law enforcement official noted. The tragedy also highlighted the challenges that law enforcement and the legal system face when dealing with family abuse cases involving significant psychological manipulation. Despite the protective measures that had been put in place, Stephen was ultimately able to carry out his plan of violence because the system struggled to fully comprehend the depth of his determination and the extent of his willingness to use violence to maintain control. The tragedy of the Plattel family forces us to confront some of the most difficult questions about human nature, family relationships, and the capacity for manipulation and violence that can exist within people who appear, on the surface, to be ordinary members of society. Stephen Plattel's actions represent an extreme example of what can happen when psychological manipulation, narcissism, and the inability to respect other people's autonomy combine in a single individual. His behavior throughout this tragedy demonstrates a complete absence of empathy, an inability to see other people as independent individuals with their own rights, and a willingness to use violence when other forms of control fail. What started out as a joyful reunion of a young woman with her birth parents soon turned sour, then shocking, and finally deadly. The case forces us to examine how someone who should have been a protector became a predator, how a reunion meant to heal became a source of devastating trauma. The psychological dynamics at play in this tragedy reveal important truths about manipulation and abuse. Stephen's behavior followed patterns that experts recognize in other cases of familial abuse: the gradual erosion of boundaries, the isolation of victims from support systems, the normalization of inappropriate behavior, and ultimately, the use of violence when control is threatened. Katie's story serves as a tragic reminder of how manipulation can masquerade as love, how vulnerability can be exploited by those who should be providing protection, and how the search for family connection can be twisted into something destructive by individuals with harmful intentions. For the surviving family members, Alyssa and her other children, Katie's adoptive family, and the extended networks of people who loved those who died, the aftermath of this tragedy represents a lifetime of processing grief, trauma, and the complex emotions that arise from such an incomprehensible loss. The legal and social service systems were forced to examine their own limitations in preventing such tragedies. How do you protect adult victims who have been manipulated into believing their situation is normal? How do you identify and intervene in cases where traditional warning signs may not be immediately apparent? How do you balance respect for adult autonomy with the need to protect vulnerable individuals? As we conclude this difficult journey together, we're reminded that some stories resist easy explanation or comfortable resolution. The tragedy of Katie and Stephen Plattel cannot be neatly categorized or explained away by simple formulas about good and evil. What we can take from this story is an understanding of the importance of recognizing manipulation in its early stages, the value of maintaining strong support networks that can provide outside perspectives when our own judgment may be compromised, and the critical need to take seriously any signs of controlling or inappropriate behavior in family relationships. We remember Katie not as a victim defined by the tragedy that ended her life, but as a young woman who was seeking connection and understanding. We remember Anthony Fusco as a father who died trying to protect the daughter he had loved and raised. We remember the innocent child whose life was cut short by violence he could never have understood. Their memories serve as a reminder of the preciousness of life, the importance of healthy family relationships built on respect and appropriate boundaries, and the ongoing need for vigilance against those who would exploit the trust and vulnerability of others. In the quiet moments as you drift toward sleep, may you find peace in the knowledge that most family reunions are joyful occasions that enrich lives rather than destroy them, that most people are capable of genuine love and appropriate relationships, and that even in the darkest of human stories, there are always those who stand ready to offer protection, support, and care to those who need it. If you or someone you know is experiencing family abuse or manipulation, resources are available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. For those affected by adoption-related trauma or seeking support for healthy reunion processes, the American Adoption Congress and similar organizations provide guidance and support. Remember that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and that no one deserves to be manipulated, controlled, or harmed by family members or anyone else. So before we move on to our next story, I want you to share your thoughts on this case and don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey to Durham, North Carolina, in the year 2007, where a promising young woman's life was cut tragically short by jealousy, betrayal, and carefully calculated violence. This is the story of Danita Monique Smith, a 25-year-old graduate student whose dreams of a bright future were shattered by a single gunshot on a cold January morning. Some crimes are born of sudden passion, others simmer slowly like a pot left too long on the stove. This is a story of the latter, a tale of obsession, deception, and the dangerous intersection of love and possessiveness. As we unfold this narrative together, we'll explore not just what happened, but how a web of lies nearly allowed a killer to escape justice. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you back to a time when snow dusted the streets of Durham, and a young woman's life hung in the balance of another's twisted jealousy. Danita Monique Smith was the kind of person who lit up a room simply by walking into it. At 25, she embodied everything we hope to see in young adulthood: ambition tempered with kindness, intelligence paired with warmth, and dreams that stretched far beyond the horizon of her current circumstances. Danita was a graduate student at North Carolina Central University, pursuing her studies with the dedication of someone who understood that education was a bridge to bigger things. She had an artistic soul, evident in her passion for photography. Through her lens, she captured not just images, but moments, the fleeting expressions of joy, the quiet beauty of everyday life, the stories that most people walk past without noticing. Her friends would later describe her as someone who had a gift for making others feel seen, heard, and valued. She wasn't just pursuing her own dreams, she was the kind of person who helped others believe in theirs too. Danita had that rare quality of being simultaneously driven and nurturing, ambitious yet deeply caring about the people in her life. In early 2006, Danita's world brightened even more when she met Jermir Stroud. Jermir was a law enforcement officer, someone who had dedicated his life to protecting and serving his community. Their relationship blossomed quickly, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. By late 2006, they were engaged, planning a future that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them. Danita's family and friends were thrilled for her. She had found someone who appreciated her ambition, supported her dreams, and seemed to offer the kind of stable, loving partnership that everyone hopes to find. Their engagement wasn't just about two people in love, it represented hope, possibility, and the promise of a life built together. As 2007 began, Danita was living at the Campus Crossing Apartments in Durham. It was a typical graduate student setup, affordable, convenient, functional. She was balancing her studies, her relationship, and her photography, managing that delicate dance that so many young people know well, building a career while nurturing a personal life, pursuing individual dreams while planning a shared future. But as Danita would soon discover, not everyone was happy about her engagement to Jermir. In fact, someone was watching her life unfold with growing resentment, someone who saw Danita not as a person with her own dreams and aspirations, but as an obstacle to be removed. Every story has shadows, and in Danita's story, that shadow had a name: Shannon Elizabeth Crawley. Shannon was 29 years old, 4 years older than Danita, and she worked as a dispatcher for Guilford Metro 911 in Greensboro. On the surface, Shannon appeared to be someone who had her life together. She had a steady job, her own place, and the kind of independence that many people her age were still striving for. But beneath that surface, Shannon was harboring a secret that would ultimately prove deadly. She had been involved in a relationship with Jermir Stroud, the same man who was now engaged to Danita Smith. This wasn't just a casual fling or a brief romantic entanglement. Shannon had developed deep feelings for Jermir, feelings that had grown into something far more dangerous than love. The exact timeline of Shannon's relationship with Jermir would later become a crucial part of the investigation. According to both Shannon and Jermir's accounts, their relationship had predated his engagement to Danita. Jermir insisted that his relationship with Shannon was over, that he had made it clear to her that their romantic involvement was in the past. But Shannon, it seemed, had never truly accepted that their relationship was over. What made Shannon's situation even more complicated was that she had become pregnant with Jermir's child. This pregnancy represented more than just a biological reality. For Shannon, it seemed to symbolize a permanent connection to Jermir, a tie that she believed should supersede his engagement to Danita. In Shannon's mind, carrying Jermir's child gave her a claim to him that Danita simply couldn't match. But Jermir's reaction to Shannon's pregnancy was not what she had hoped for. According to police reports and testimony, Jermir made it clear that he didn't want to have a child with Shannon. He had moved on with his life, committed to his engagement with Danita, and while he would take responsibility for the child, he wasn't going to abandon his fiancée or his plans for the future. This rejection was devastating for Shannon. She had invested so much emotional energy in the belief that Jermir would choose her, that the pregnancy would bring them together, that somehow she could reclaim the relationship she felt she deserved. Instead, she found herself pregnant, alone, and watching the man she loved plan a future with another woman. Shannon's response to this rejection was telling. Rather than accepting Jermir's decision and moving forward with her own life, she began a campaign of persistent contact. She would call Jermir repeatedly, show up at his place unannounced, and try to maintain a connection that he was clearly trying to end. This behavior revealed something troubling about Shannon's psychological state. She seemed unable or unwilling to accept that Jermir had made his choice, and that choice wasn't her. As the months passed and Jermir's engagement to Danita grew stronger, Shannon's behavior became increasingly erratic. She wasn't just a woman dealing with an unwanted pregnancy or a broken heart, she was becoming something more dangerous, a person who had convinced herself that the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted was Danita Smith. The final months of 2006 and the early days of 2007 were a period of mounting tension, though Danita herself may not have been fully aware of the storm clouds gathering around her life. While she was planning her future with Jermir, Shannon was consumed by thoughts of what she had lost and what she believed she deserved. Shannon's persistence in contacting Jermir wasn't just about trying to rekindle their romance, it was about trying to make him understand that she should be his priority, that their shared history and her pregnancy created obligations that should supersede his engagement to Danita. She seemed to believe that if she could just make him see the situation from her perspective, he would realize that he was making a mistake. But Jermir's position remained consistent. He had moved on. He was committed to Danita. While he would take responsibility for the child Shannon was carrying, he wasn't going to abandon his fiancée or his plans for the future. This unwavering stance only intensified Shannon's frustration and desperation. What made Shannon's situation even more psychologically complex was that she had access to information about Jameer's life through her persistence in maintaining contact. She knew about his plans with Danita, his daily routines, his work schedule. She was like someone watching a movie of the life she believed should have been hers, forced to witness every scene of happiness and planning that didn't include her. The psychological impact of this situation on Shannon cannot be understated. She was dealing with pregnancy hormones, the stress of an unwanted situation, the humiliation of being rejected, and the constant reminder that the man she loved was building a life with someone else. These factors created a perfect storm of emotional instability. During this period, Shannon's behavior became increasingly focused on the perceived obstacle to her happiness, Danita Smith. In Shannon's mind, Danita wasn't just Jameer's fiancée, she was the reason Shannon couldn't have the life she wanted. This kind of thinking, where one person becomes the sole target of blame for all of life's disappointments, is a dangerous psychological state that can lead to desperate actions. Shannon began to pay closer attention to Danita's life, her routines, her apartment complex. She learned that Danita lived at Campus Crossing Apartments in Durham, that she was a graduate student, that she had dreams and aspirations that extended far beyond her relationship with Jameer. But Shannon didn't see Danita as a full person with her own rights and dreams, she saw her as an obstacle to be removed. As January 2007 approached, Shannon was facing a critical decision point. She could accept the reality of her situation, focus on her pregnancy and her own future, and try to build a life that didn't revolve around Jameer Stroud. Or she could take more drastic action to remove what she saw as the only thing standing between her and the life she wanted. The choice Shannon made would change multiple lives forever and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy, investigation, and ultimately, justice. January 4, 2007, dawned cold and gray in Durham, North Carolina. It was the kind of winter morning that makes you want to stay under warm covers a little longer, the kind of day where even simple tasks feel like they require extra effort. For most people in the city, it was just another Thursday, classes resuming after the holiday break, people returning to their normal routines, life continuing its regular rhythm. For Danita Smith, it was supposed to be a day like any other. She had plans, responsibilities, the ordinary activities that fill a graduate student's life. She was living in her second-floor apartment at Campus Crossing Apartments, a complex popular with students and young professionals. The building had external stairs leading to the upper floors, the kind of practical, no-frills design common in student housing. Danita was preparing to leave her apartment that morning, gathering her belongings, checking her schedule, going through the small rituals that begin each day. She had no way of knowing that someone had been watching her routine, studying her movements, planning something that would end her life before she could take another step toward her future. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, Danita opened her apartment door and stepped onto the external staircase. She was carrying her purse and other personal items, dressed for the day ahead, her mind probably focused on the tasks and obligations waiting for her. The stairs were steep and led directly down to the sidewalk below, where residents would typically walk to their cars or toward the bus stop. As Danita began her descent down the stairs, she was completely unaware that someone was approaching from behind. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment, who had planned this encounter with meticulous care, who saw Danita not as a person with hopes and dreams, but as a problem to be solved. The attack came without warning. A single gunshot rang out across the quiet morning air, the sound echoing off the apartment buildings and shattering the peaceful start to the day. Danita was struck in the head, the bullet ending her life in an instant. The force of the impact sent her tumbling down the remaining stairs, her body coming to rest at the bottom of the stairwell. Her purse and belongings scattered across the steps and sidewalk, creating a heartbreaking scene of interrupted life. The items that had been part of her daily routine, her keys, her wallet, her phone, were now evidence of a life cut short, dreams that would never be realized, a future that would never unfold. The maintenance worker who discovered Danita's body just minutes later would later tell police that he had heard the gunshot but hadn't initially realized what it was. When he came around the corner and saw Danita's body at the bottom of the stairs, his first thought was that she had fallen. It was only when he looked more closely that he realized the terrible truth: this was no accident. The same maintenance worker would provide a crucial piece of information to investigators. He told police that shortly after hearing the gunshot, he had seen a woman crying and running away from the apartment complex. This woman was in obvious distress, moving quickly toward the parking area. He watched as she got into a Ford Explorer and drove away, tires squealing as she left the scene. This witness account would prove to be vital to the investigation. The maintenance worker's description of the fleeing woman and her vehicle would help investigators understand that Danita's death was not a random crime, not a robbery gone wrong, but something far more personal and calculated. As the Durham Police Department arrived at the scene, they found a young woman whose life had been stolen in the most brutal way possible. Danita Smith, who had been planning her wedding, pursuing her education, and building a future with the man she loved, was now a victim of homicide. The investigation that followed would reveal a story of jealousy, obsession, and calculated murder that shocked everyone who knew the people involved. The Durham Police Department's response to the Campus Crossing apartments was swift and thorough. When officers arrived at the scene, they found what initially appeared to be a tragic accident: a young woman who had apparently fallen down a flight of stairs. But experienced investigators know that appearances can be deceiving, and a closer examination of the scene revealed evidence that would change the entire trajectory of the case. The first crucial discovery was the gunshot wound to Danita's head. This wasn't a fall, this was a homicide. The bullet had entered her head from behind, suggesting that the shooter had approached from behind as she was walking down the stairs. The angle and trajectory of the bullet would later help investigators understand exactly how the attack had unfolded. Detective work in a case like this requires both scientific precision and psychological insight. The investigators had to piece together not just the physical evidence of what happened, but also the human relationships and motivations that led to this moment. They began by examining Danita's life, looking for anyone who might have wanted to harm her. What they found was a young woman who seemed to have no enemies. Danita's friends, family, and classmates all described her as kind, ambitious, and well-liked. She wasn't involved in any conflicts, didn't have any known disputes, and lived a relatively quiet life focused on her studies and her relationship with Jermir. This made the investigation more challenging. If Danita wasn't the kind of person who made enemies, then why would someone want to kill her? The answer came when investigators began to examine Jermir Stroud's life more closely. It was during these interviews that the existence of Shannon Crawley first came to light. Jermir told police about his previous relationship with Shannon, her pregnancy, and her persistent attempts to maintain contact with him despite his engagement to Danita. The maintenance worker's description of the woman fleeing the scene became increasingly important as investigators learned more about Shannon. He described seeing a woman in distress, crying and running away from the apartment complex, getting into a Ford Explorer and driving away quickly. When investigators learned that Shannon Crawley drove a Ford Explorer, they knew they had found their primary suspect. But having a suspect and proving their guilt are two very different things. The investigators needed to build a case that would stand up in court, which meant gathering physical evidence, establishing motive, and constructing a timeline that would demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that Shannon Crawley was responsible for Danita Smith's murder. The motive seemed clear: jealousy over Jermir's relationship with Danita, combined with the stress of an unwanted pregnancy and the humiliation of being rejected. Shannon saw Danita as the obstacle to the life she wanted, and she had decided to remove that obstacle permanently. But proving that Shannon was actually at the Campus Crossing apartments on the morning of January 4, 2007, required careful detective work. Investigators began examining Shannon's movements in the days leading up to the murder, looking for evidence that she had been planning this attack. They discovered that Shannon had called in sick to work on January 4, 2007, the day of the murder. This was significant because Shannon worked as a 911 dispatcher in Greensboro, a job that required her to be reliable and present. Taking a sick day wasn't something she did frequently, and the timing was suspicious. Investigators also began examining Shannon's phone records, looking for any calls or messages that might provide insight into her state of mind or her whereabouts on the morning of the murder. They found evidence of continued contact with Jermier, including attempts to reach him that became more frequent and desperate as his engagement to Danita grew stronger. 5 days after Danita's murder, on January 9, 2007, police arrested Shannon Crawley and charged her with first-degree murder. The arrest was the result of careful investigation, witness testimony, and a growing body of evidence that pointed to Shannon as the killer. But Shannon's arrest was just the beginning of a legal process that would test the strength of the evidence and the ability of prosecutors to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. When Shannon Crawley was arrested for the murder of Danita Smith, she didn't maintain her innocence in the way that most people might expect. Instead of denying any involvement in the crime, Shannon told a story that was both shocking and strategically calculated, a story that would attempt to shift the blame for Danita's murder onto the very man she claimed to love. Shannon's version of events was elaborate and carefully constructed. She admitted to being at the Campus Crossing apartments on the morning of January 4, 2007, but she claimed that she wasn't there to harm Danita. According to Shannon, she was there to confront Danita about her relationship with Jermier, to try to make her understand that Jermier belonged with Shannon and their unborn child. But Shannon's story took a dramatic turn when she claimed that Jermier Stroud himself was the one who had killed Danita. She told investigators that Jermier had been at the apartment complex that morning, that he had been the one with the gun, and that he had forced Shannon to help him cover up the crime. According to Shannon, she was as much a victim as Danita, manipulated and coerced by a man who was willing to kill to protect his reputation. This was not just a denial of guilt, it was a complete reframing of the crime. Shannon was positioning herself not as a jealous killer, but as a frightened woman who had been caught up in a situation beyond her control. She claimed that Jermier had threatened her, that he had made her participate in covering up the murder, and that she had been too scared to come forward with the truth. To support her story, Shannon produced what she claimed was a recording of Jermier confessing to the murder. This recording, she said, was proof that Jermier was the real killer and that she was simply trying to protect herself and her unborn child from a dangerous man. But investigators and prosecutors weren't convinced by Shannon's story. They had several reasons to doubt her version of events. First, the timeline didn't match up with what they knew about Jermier's whereabouts on the morning of the murder. Jermier had been at work, with multiple colleagues who could verify his presence. The logistics of Shannon's story simply didn't work. Second, Shannon's behavior in the days following the murder was inconsistent with her claim of being a frightened victim. She had continued to go to work, maintained her normal routine, and showed no signs of the trauma that would be expected from someone who had witnessed a murder and been coerced into helping cover it up. Most importantly, the physical evidence didn't support Shannon's story. The witness who had seen a woman fleeing the scene had described someone who was alone, not someone who was with a male companion. The ballistics evidence suggested a single shooter, not a scenario involving multiple people. The recording that Shannon produced as evidence of Jermier's confession was also problematic. Audio experts who examined the recording found evidence of editing and manipulation. The conversation didn't flow naturally, and there were technical indicators that suggested the recording had been altered or constructed from multiple sources. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of Shannon as someone who was not just capable of murder, but also capable of elaborate deception. Her story about Jermier being the killer wasn't a panicked reaction to being caught, it was a carefully planned defense strategy designed to shift blame away from herself. Shannon had calculated that the best way to avoid responsibility for Danita's murder was to blame the one person who had as much to lose as she did, Jermier himself. She was counting on the fact that a jury might believe that a man would be more likely to commit murder than a pregnant woman, and that the existence of a confession recording would create reasonable doubt about her guilt. But Shannon had underestimated both the thoroughness of the investigation and the intelligence of the jury who would ultimately decide her fate. The trial of Shannon Crawley began on February 8, 2010, in Durham County Superior Court, with the Honorable Judge Ronald Stevens presiding. More than 3 years had passed since Danita Smith's murder, 3 years during which both families had been living with the tragedy and waiting for justice. The trial would be the culmination of years of investigation, preparation, and the pursuit of truth. The prosecution, led by experienced prosecutors who understood the complexity of the case, had a clear strategy: present the evidence methodically, establish Shannon's motive, and demonstrate that her story about Jermier being the killer was a fabrication designed to avoid responsibility for her own actions. They began by painting a picture of Danita Smith as a vibrant young woman whose life was cut short by jealousy and obsession. They showed the jury photographs of Danita, talked about her dreams and aspirations, and made it clear that this wasn't just a legal case, it was about justice for a real person whose future had been stolen. The prosecution then turned to the evidence. They called the maintenance worker who had discovered Danita's body and witnessed the fleeing woman. His testimony was crucial because it established that a single woman had been seen running from the scene, not a woman who was with a male companion as Shannon's story suggested. They presented the ballistics evidence, showing that Danita had been shot from behind with a single bullet to the head. This wasn't a crime of passion that had escalated out of control, it was an execution, planned and carried out with precision. The prosecution also presented evidence of Shannon's behavior in the days leading up to the murder. They showed phone records demonstrating her persistent attempts to contact Jermier, her obsessive behavior, and her refusal to accept that their relationship was over. They painted a picture of a woman who had become so consumed with jealousy that she was willing to kill to get what she wanted. When it came to Shannon's claim that Jermier was the real killer, the prosecution systematically dismantled her story. They presented evidence of Jermier's whereabouts on the morning of the murder, showing that he had been at work with multiple witnesses who could verify his presence. They brought in audio experts who testified about the problems with Shannon's recording, explaining how it showed signs of manipulation and editing. The defense, for their part, tried to present Shannon as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. They emphasized her pregnancy, her emotional state, and her claim that she had been coerced by Jermier. They played the recording she had produced, arguing that it was evidence of Jermier's guilt and Shannon's innocence. But the defense faced a significant challenge: the evidence against Shannon was overwhelming, and her story had too many holes to be credible. The jury was being asked to believe that a law enforcement officer had committed murder and then successfully coerced a pregnant woman into helping him cover it up, all while maintaining his normal work schedule and showing no signs of stress or guilt. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful and direct. They asked the jury to look at the facts, not the stories. They pointed out that Shannon had motive, opportunity, and means. She had called in sick on the day of the murder, giving her the freedom to carry out her plan. She drove a Ford Explorer, matching the vehicle seen leaving the scene. She had access to a gun and the knowledge of Danita's routine that would have been necessary to plan the attack. Most importantly, the prosecution argued, Shannon's elaborate story about Jermier being the killer was exactly what you would expect from someone who had carefully planned not just a murder, but also a defense strategy. This wasn't a panicked reaction to being caught, it was a calculated attempt to manipulate the justice system. The defense's closing argument asked the jury to consider Shannon's emotional state, her pregnancy, and the possibility that she had been telling the truth about Jermier's involvement. But they were fighting an uphill battle against a mountain of evidence and a story that simply didn't hold up under scrutiny. After hearing all the evidence and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. They had to weigh the testimony, examine the evidence, and decide whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Shannon Crawley was guilty of first-degree murder. The jury in Shannon Crawley's trial deliberated for approximately 7 hours over 2 days. 7 hours to review 3 years of investigation, weeks of testimony, and a complex web of evidence and competing narratives. 7 hours to decide whether Shannon Crawley was a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstances beyond her control. When the jury returned to the courtroom on February 22, 2010, their verdict was clear and unambiguous: guilty of first-degree murder. They had looked at all the evidence, considered Shannon's story about Jermir being the real killer, and concluded that the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The conviction was a moment of validation for the investigators who had worked tirelessly to build the case, for the prosecutors who had pursued justice, and most importantly, for Danita Smith's family and friends who had been waiting 3 years for this moment. Judge Ronald Stevens didn't hesitate in his sentencing. North Carolina law requires that a conviction for first-degree murder carry a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and that's exactly what Shannon Crawley received. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying the price for her jealousy, her obsession, and her decision to solve her problems through violence. The sentencing hearing was an emotional moment for everyone involved. Danita's mother, Sharon Smith, addressed Shannon directly, saying, "Someday, I may forgive you, but I don't right now. Because of what Shannon did, there is a void. You took her away from me." These words captured the irreparable damage that Shannon's actions had caused, not just to Danita, but to everyone who loved her. Shannon's conviction and sentencing brought a measure of closure to the case, but it couldn't bring back Danita Smith or undo the tragedy that had unfolded. Danita's family and friends were left to grieve not just for what they had lost, but for what would never be, the wedding that would never happen, the career that would never flourish, the children that would never be born, the life that would never be lived. The case also served as a sobering reminder of how jealousy and obsession can transform ordinary people into killers. Shannon Crawley wasn't a career criminal or someone with a history of violence. She was a 911 dispatcher, someone whose job was to help people in emergencies. But her inability to accept rejection, combined with her obsessive focus on Jermir Stroud, had turned her into a cold-blooded killer. The elaborate nature of Shannon's defense, her attempt to blame Jermir for the murder, also revealed something disturbing about her character. Even after killing Danita, Shannon was willing to destroy another innocent person's life to save herself. Her fake recording and fabricated story about Jermir being the killer showed that she was capable not just of violence, but of sustained deception and manipulation. Today, Shannon Crawley remains in prison, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. She is now in her mid-40s, and if she lives a normal lifespan, she will spend the next 30 to 40 years behind bars. She will never again be free to make the choices that led to Danita Smith's death. Jermir Stroud was forced to live with the trauma of losing his fiancée and being falsely accused of her murder. The case destroyed his relationship with Shannon, obviously, but it also forced him to confront the reality that his past relationship had led to the death of the woman he loved. Danita Smith's family established a scholarship in her memory, ensuring that her passion for education and helping others would continue to make a difference in the world. It's a fitting tribute to someone whose life was about growth, learning, and making the world a better place. As we conclude this story, it's important to remember that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence. Danita Smith wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, a fiancée, a student, a friend, and a woman with dreams that extended far beyond the circumstances of her death. Her story reminds us that jealousy and obsession can lead to tragic consequences, that the inability to accept rejection can transform love into something deadly, and that the choices we make in our darkest moments can echo through the lives of countless others. Justice was served in the case of Danita Smith's murder, but justice can never truly restore what was lost. It can only ensure that those responsible face the consequences of their actions and that the rest of us remember the importance of treating each other with respect, accepting the choices others make, and finding healthy ways to deal with disappointment and rejection. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Danita Smith not for how she died, but for how she lived, with hope, ambition, and kindness. May her memory serve as a reminder of the preciousness of life and the importance of choosing love over hatred, acceptance over obsession, and peace over violence. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. In the sprawling desert landscape of Phoenix, Arizona, where the sun beats down relentlessly and the city spreads endlessly toward mountain ranges that pierce the horizon, there exists a world of dreams and ambitions, of young people building their lives under the vast southwestern sky. It's a place where the energy of growth and possibility mingles with the harsh realities of urban life, where thousands of stories unfold daily beneath the desert sun. This is the story of one such person, Mercedes Vega, a 22-year-old woman who embodied the spirit of her generation, independent, social, connected to her community, and determined to make her mark on the world. She was the kind of young woman who lit up a room when she entered, who maintained friendships across different circles, and who approached life with the kind of enthusiasm that made others gravitate toward her. On April 17, 2023, as spring was settling into the Valley of the Sun and Phoenix was experiencing the perfect weather that draws millions to Arizona each year, Mercedes was preparing for what should have been just another ordinary evening with friends. She had plans for dinner, the kind of casual social gathering that forms the backbone of young adult life, the simple pleasure of good food and good company after a day of work and responsibility. What unfolded that evening would become one of Phoenix's most perplexing mysteries, a case that would challenge investigators and haunt a community. It's a story of a young woman who simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of questions that grow more complex with each passing month, and a family desperate for answers in a case that seems to defy explanation. As we journey through Mercedes's story together, we'll explore the vibrant life of a young woman making her way in one of America's fastest-growing cities, the moment when normalcy transformed into mystery, and the ongoing search for answers that continues to this day. We'll witness how modern technology can both help and hinder investigations, how urban landscapes can swallow people without a trace, and how the absence of answers can be more haunting than the most disturbing truths. The desert that surrounds Phoenix has always been a place of secrets, where the vastness of the landscape can hide evidence and the harsh conditions can erase traces of human activity. But Mercedes didn't disappear into the wilderness, she vanished from the heart of the city, in a place where cameras watch and people notice, making her disappearance all the more mysterious and troubling. Mercedes Vega was born into the modern American Southwest, raised in a community where diverse cultures blend together under the endless Arizona sky, creating a unique tapestry of traditions, languages, and dreams. Phoenix, with its promise of opportunity and its reputation as a place where people could reinvent themselves, had drawn her family like it had drawn millions of others seeking a better life in the desert. From her earliest years, Mercedes displayed the kind of outgoing personality that made her naturally suited to thrive in a city like Phoenix. She was comfortable in social situations, equally at ease with longtime friends and new acquaintances, possessing that rare quality of making others feel welcomed and valued in her presence. Her friends often described her as the kind of person who could walk into any situation and immediately make it better simply by being there. The Phoenix that Mercedes knew was a city of contrasts, sprawling suburban neighborhoods, bustling downtown districts, desert preserves that offered escape from urban life, and a growing arts and entertainment scene that attracted young professionals from across the country. It was a place where someone like Mercedes could build a life that combined professional ambition with social connection, where the weather allowed for year-round outdoor activities and the growing economy provided opportunities for career advancement. Mercedes had established herself as someone who understood how to navigate this complex urban environment. She had built a network of friends and acquaintances across different social circles, maintained connections with family members, and was actively engaged in the kind of social media presence that defined her generation's approach to community building and personal expression. Her apartment complex in central Phoenix represented the kind of modern urban living that attracted young professionals to the area. The development was relatively new, designed with the amenities and security features that made residents feel safe and comfortable. It included covered parking, which was essential in the Arizona heat, controlled access to residential areas, and the kind of surveillance systems that had become standard in contemporary apartment complexes. The location was strategic, close enough to downtown Phoenix to make commuting manageable, but far enough from the urban core to offer a sense of residential tranquility. The neighborhood was the kind of place where young professionals could build independent lives while maintaining easy access to the restaurants, entertainment venues, and employment opportunities that made Phoenix attractive to their demographic. Mercedes's social life reflected the patterns of her generation and her city. She maintained friendships through a combination of in-person activities and digital communication, organized social gatherings that brought different groups of friends together, and participated in the kind of dining and entertainment culture that thrived in Phoenix's diverse restaurant and nightlife scene. Her approach to friendship was generous and inclusive. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays, organized group activities, and made sure that plans actually happened rather than remaining in the realm of good intentions. Her friends relied on her not just for companionship, but for the organizational energy that turned casual ideas into actual events. The evening of April 17, 2023, was supposed to be exactly this kind of event, a dinner gathering with friends that Mercedes had helped coordinate. It was the kind of social activity that represented everything she enjoyed about her life in Phoenix: good friends, good food, and the opportunity to strengthen the relationships that made her life meaningful and enjoyable. Mercedes had spent the day in her normal routine, handling the various responsibilities of adult life, work commitments, personal tasks, and the ongoing communication with friends that was necessary to coordinate their evening plans. She had confirmed the details of their dinner, made sure everyone knew where they were meeting, and prepared for what should have been several hours of relaxed conversation and shared enjoyment. As evening approached, Mercedes went through her usual preparation routine. She chose her outfit with the kind of care that reflected both her personal style and her respect for the friends she would be spending time with. She gathered her essentials: phone, keys, wallet, and the other items that had become indispensable to modern life, and prepared to leave her apartment for what should have been a simple drive to meet her friends. The parking garage of her apartment complex was a familiar space, one she had navigated countless times since moving into the building. It was well lit, equipped with security cameras, and generally considered safe by residents. The covered parking was one of the amenities that had attracted her to the complex, providing protection from the intense Arizona sun and offering a sense of security for residents returning home at various hours. What happened in that parking garage would become the focal point of an investigation that has continued for months without resolution. Mercedes was captured on surveillance footage walking toward her vehicle, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had places to be and people waiting for her. She appeared completely normal, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The footage showed her reaching her car and preparing to leave for her dinner engagement. She was doing exactly what thousands of Phoenix residents do every day, leaving their homes to meet friends for an evening out. There was nothing in her demeanor or the circumstances to suggest that anything was wrong or that she was facing any kind of threat. But somewhere between that moment in the parking garage and her planned arrival at the restaurant where her friends were waiting, Mercedes Vega vanished completely. She never arrived for dinner, never responded to increasingly concerned text messages from friends, and never returned to the apartment that held all her possessions and represented the life she had been building in Phoenix. April 17, 2023, dawned as one of those perfect Phoenix spring days that reminded residents why they had chosen to make their lives in the Sonoran Desert. The temperature was in the comfortable range that made outdoor activities pleasant, the sky was clear with the kind of unlimited visibility that allowed views of distant mountain ranges, and there was a sense of energy in the air that comes with perfect weather in a vibrant city. Mercedes Vega began her day with the same routine that had become familiar over the months she had lived in her central Phoenix apartment. She had work responsibilities to handle, personal tasks that required attention, and the ongoing coordination with friends that was necessary to finalize their dinner plans for that evening. It was exactly the kind of balanced life that she had worked to create, professional responsibilities mixed with personal relationships and social activities. The day progressed normally, with Mercedes handling her various commitments while maintaining the kind of regular communication with friends that characterized her approach to relationships. She confirmed details about their dinner reservation, made sure everyone had the correct address and timing information, and engaged in the kind of casual conversation that builds anticipation for shared social experiences. Her friends later described Mercedes as being in typical good spirits throughout the day. There were no signs of distress, no unusual concerns, and no indication that she was dealing with any personal or professional problems that might have affected her mood or behavior. She was looking forward to their dinner gathering with the kind of enthusiasm that was characteristic of her approach to social activities. As afternoon transitioned into early evening, Mercedes began her preparation for the night out. She approached getting ready with the same attention to detail that she brought to other aspects of her life, choosing an outfit that reflected both her personal style and the type of restaurant where they would be dining. Her selections were thoughtful but not excessive, reflecting someone who cared about making a good impression but wasn't obsessed with appearance. The restaurant chosen for their gathering was one of those establishments that had become popular with Phoenix's young professional community, a place that offered good food in a casual but stylish atmosphere, the kind of venue that encouraged conversation and provided a comfortable setting for friends to catch up with each other's lives. It was located in a part of town that was easily accessible from various parts of the Phoenix metropolitan area, making it a logical choice for a group gathering. Mercedes's apartment complex was typical of the modern developments that had sprung up across Phoenix to accommodate the city's growing population of young professionals. The building featured contemporary design, modern amenities, and the kind of security features that made residents feel safe and comfortable. The covered parking garage was one of the most appreciated amenities, providing essential protection from the intense Arizona sun while offering residents a secure place to leave their vehicles. The parking garage itself was well designed and well maintained, with adequate lighting, clear sight lines, and surveillance cameras positioned to monitor activity throughout the space. It was the kind of facility that residents used confidently at all hours of the day and night, feeling secure in its design and the building's overall approach to resident safety. Surveillance footage from that evening shows Mercedes entering the parking garage at approximately 6:30 p.m., moving with the confident stride of someone who was comfortable in familiar surroundings and looking forward to the evening ahead. She was dressed appropriately for dinner with friends, carrying the essentials she would need for the evening, and displaying none of the behaviors that might suggest she was concerned about her safety or dealing with any unusual circumstances. The footage captured Mercedes approaching her vehicle, a car that had served her well during her time in Phoenix and provided the independence that was essential for navigating the sprawling metropolitan area. She appeared to be following her normal routine, showing no signs of hesitation or concern as she prepared to drive to meet her friends. What the surveillance cameras documented was completely ordinary, a young woman leaving her apartment to meet friends for dinner, the kind of routine activity that happens thousands of times every day across Phoenix. There was nothing in Mercedes's behavior or the circumstances surrounding her departure that suggested anything unusual was about to occur. The drive from Mercedes's apartment complex to the restaurant should have taken approximately 20 to 25 minutes, depending on traffic conditions. It was a route that involved major Phoenix arterial roads, areas with significant traffic and numerous other drivers, businesses, and pedestrians. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a straightforward journey through familiar territory. Mercedes's friends arrived at the restaurant on schedule, anticipating an enjoyable evening of conversation, good food, and the kind of social connection that made their friendships meaningful. They secured their table, reviewed the menu, and began the kind of casual conversation that fills the time while waiting for other members of a group to arrive. As 7 p.m. passed, then 7:15, Mercedes's friends began to feel the first stirrings of concern. She was typically punctual and considerate about communication, usually providing updates if she was running late or facing unexpected delays. The absence of any text messages or phone calls was unusual and began to create a sense of unease among the group. By 7:30 p.m., concern had transformed into active worry. Mercedes's friends began trying to reach her through multiple communication channels, text messages, phone calls, social media messaging, but received no responses. This complete lack of communication was entirely unlike Mercedes, who was known for staying connected with friends and being responsive to messages. The friends made the decision to contact Mercedes's family members, hoping that she might have experienced some kind of emergency that had prevented her from communicating with the dinner group. However, family members had not heard from Mercedes either and became immediately concerned when they learned that she was missing from a planned social engagement. What should have been a routine evening of friendship and conversation had become the beginning of a mystery that would puzzle investigators and haunt everyone who cared about Mercedes. Somewhere between the parking garage surveillance footage and the restaurant where her friends were waiting, a young woman had simply vanished without explanation. The realization that Mercedes Vega was truly missing came gradually, then all at once. What began as mild concern about lateness transformed into serious worry as hours passed without any communication from someone known for staying connected with friends and family. By the time her dinner companions made the difficult decision to contact law enforcement, nearly 24 hours had passed since Mercedes was last seen on surveillance footage. The Phoenix Police Department's response to the missing person report reflected both the seriousness with which they treat such cases and the challenging reality of investigating disappearances in a metropolitan area of nearly 5 million people. Phoenix, with its sprawling geography and complex urban landscape, presents unique challenges for law enforcement when someone vanishes without clear evidence of what occurred. Detective Sarah Martinez, who was assigned as the lead investigator on Mercedes's case, brought more than 15 years of experience to the investigation. She had worked numerous missing person cases during her career, understanding both the urgency these cases required and the methodical approach that would be necessary to uncover the truth about what had happened to Mercedes. The initial investigation began with the surveillance footage from Mercedes's apartment complex, which provided the last confirmed sighting of her alive and moving freely. The footage was clear and comprehensive, showing Mercedes walking through the parking garage, approaching her vehicle, and preparing to leave for her dinner engagement. Most importantly, the footage showed no signs of distress, no interaction with other individuals, and no indication that she was facing any immediate threat. Investigators expanded their search to examine surveillance footage from businesses, traffic cameras, and other sources along the route Mercedes would have taken to reach the restaurant. Phoenix's extensive network of traffic monitoring cameras and business security systems provided numerous opportunities to track her movements, but this digital dragnet failed to capture any trace of Mercedes or her vehicle after she left the apartment complex. The absence of Mercedes's car became a critical element in the investigation. Vehicle location is often one of the most important early breaks in missing person cases, as cars are large, visible objects that are difficult to hide completely. The fact that both Mercedes and her vehicle had vanished suggested either that they had traveled outside the range of surveillance systems or that something had occurred that prevented the normal patterns of digital documentation that characterize modern urban life. Mercedes's family members provided investigators with detailed information about her habits, relationships, and recent activities. They painted a picture of a young woman who was generally happy, socially connected, and not dealing with any personal crises that might have motivated a voluntary disappearance. Her financial accounts showed no unusual activity, her social media presence revealed no concerning communications, and her employment situation was stable and satisfactory. The investigation into Mercedes's personal relationships revealed the kind of complex but generally healthy social network that characterized many young adults in a major metropolitan area. She maintained friendships with people from different periods of her life and various social circles, had casual dating relationships that appeared to be free of serious conflict, and showed no signs of being involved in any disputes or dangerous situations. Friends and family members were interviewed extensively about Mercedes's state of mind in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance. The picture that emerged was of someone who was content with her life in Phoenix, engaged with her work and social activities, and looking forward to future plans and goals. There were no red flags that suggested she was contemplating leaving her life behind or that she was involved in any activities that might have put her in danger. The search for Mercedes expanded beyond the digital realm to include physical searches of areas where she might have encountered trouble. Phoenix's surrounding desert areas, with their vast expanses and remote locations, have unfortunately been the discovery sites for victims of various crimes over the years. Search teams including volunteers, law enforcement personnel, and specialized search and rescue units began systematic examinations of areas where evidence might be found. The Phoenix metropolitan area's sheer size presented enormous challenges for physical searches. The region encompasses hundreds of square miles of urban development, desert terrain, mountain foothills, and agricultural areas. Without specific information about where to focus search efforts, investigators faced the daunting task of trying to cover vast areas while hoping for the kind of evidence that would narrow their focus. Mercedes's disappearance quickly gained attention from local media outlets, who recognized both the human interest element of the story and its potential significance as a public safety issue. News coverage helped spread awareness of the case throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area, generating tips and potential leads while also serving to keep pressure on law enforcement to dedicate adequate resources to the investigation. The media attention also highlighted the broader context of missing person cases in major metropolitan areas. Phoenix, like other large cities, deals with numerous missing person reports each year, ranging from cases that are resolved quickly when individuals are located safe to more serious situations that remain unsolved for months or years. Mercedes's case fell into the more troubling category, a complete disappearance with no clear explanation or obvious leads. Social media played a significant role in spreading awareness about Mercedes's disappearance, with friends and family members using various platforms to share information, coordinate search efforts, and maintain public attention on the case. The digital networking that characterized Mercedes's social life became a tool for organizing the search for her, demonstrating both the power and limitations of modern communication technology in crisis situations. As weeks passed without significant developments, the investigation began to take on the characteristics of a cold case while still remaining active. Investigators continued to follow up on tips and leads, but the absence of clear evidence or witnesses made progress increasingly difficult. The case remained a priority for the Phoenix Police Department, but the practical challenges of investigating a disappearance with so few concrete leads became increasingly apparent. In the modern era of digital connectivity, people leave electronic traces of their activities throughout each day: credit card transactions, cell phone pings, social media interactions, GPS tracking, and countless other forms of digital evidence that can help investigators piece together the final hours of someone who has disappeared. The absence of such evidence in Mercedes Vega's case made her disappearance even more mysterious and challenging for investigators. Mercedes's cell phone, which like most people her age was essentially an extension of herself, went silent at the same time she vanished. Cell phone towers in the Phoenix area showed no activity from her device after she left her apartment complex, suggesting either that the phone had been turned off, destroyed, or moved to an area without cellular coverage. The complete absence of cell phone activity was particularly troubling because it eliminated one of the most reliable tools investigators have for tracking missing persons. Financial records provided another avenue of investigation that yielded frustrating results. Mercedes's bank accounts, credit cards, and other financial instruments showed no activity after her disappearance. There were no ATM transactions, no credit card purchases, no electronic transfers, and no other signs of financial activity that might have indicated where she had gone or what had happened to her. The complete cessation of financial activity suggested either that Mercedes was unable to access her accounts or that she was no longer in a position to make financial transactions. Social media analysis revealed a similar pattern of sudden silence. Mercedes, who had been active on various social media platforms, stopped posting, commenting, and interacting online at the time of her disappearance. Her accounts remained active, but showed no signs of continued use, which was particularly significant given her generation's typically constant engagement with social media platforms. The investigation expanded to include analysis of traffic cameras and business surveillance systems throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. Investigators worked systematically to identify possible routes Mercedes might have taken from her apartment complex, examining footage from cameras positioned along major arterial roads, at shopping centers, gas stations, and other locations where her vehicle might have been captured on video. This digital canvassing of the Phoenix area represented thousands of hours of investigative work, as detectives and analysts reviewed footage from dozens of cameras, looking for any sign of Mercedes or her vehicle. The process was methodical but ultimately frustrating, as no clear evidence emerged to indicate which direction she had traveled or where she might have encountered trouble. The Phoenix area's geography added complexity to the search efforts. The metropolitan region is surrounded by vast desert areas, mountain ranges, and remote locations where evidence could be hidden or where someone could disappear without immediate detection. The Sonoran Desert, with its harsh conditions and sparse population, has unfortunately been the location where victims of various crimes have been discovered in the past, making it a focus of search efforts. Specialized search teams, including K-9 units trained to detect human remains, conducted systematic searches of desert areas surrounding Phoenix. These efforts were coordinated with local volunteer organizations, hiking groups familiar with desert terrain, and search and rescue teams with experience in the challenging conditions of the Southwest. The searches were physically demanding and technically complex, requiring careful coordination to cover large areas effectively while maintaining the safety of search personnel. The investigation also examined the possibility that Mercedes's disappearance might be connected to other missing person cases or criminal activities in the Phoenix area. Investigators analyzed patterns of similar disappearances, looking for commonalities that might suggest a serial offender or organized criminal activity. However, this analysis failed to reveal clear connections between Mercedes's case and other incidents. Mercedes's vehicle remained one of the most significant missing pieces of the puzzle. Modern cars contain numerous electronic systems that can potentially be tracked or detected, and the complete absence of any trace of her vehicle suggested either sophisticated concealment or movement to areas outside the normal range of detection systems. The fact that both Mercedes and her car had vanished simultaneously was particularly puzzling and concerning. Investigators explored the possibility that Mercedes might have been the victim of a carjacking or similar crime that occurred shortly after she left her apartment complex. Phoenix, like other major metropolitan areas, experiences various forms of vehicular crime, and the timing of Mercedes's disappearance, as she was traveling alone to meet friends, could have made her vulnerable to such an attack. However, the absence of evidence supporting the carjacking theory was problematic. There were no reports of suspicious activity in the area around Mercedes's apartment complex, no witnesses who observed anything unusual, and no recovered evidence that might indicate a violent crime had occurred. The investigation revealed that Mercedes had simply vanished without leaving behind the kind of evidence that typically accompanies crimes involving vehicles. The investigation expanded to include analysis of Mercedes's online activities in the weeks and months leading up to her disappearance. Investigators examined her social media interactions, email communications, and other digital activities looking for any signs of concerning contacts, threatening communications, or involvement in risky activities that might have contributed to her disappearance. This digital investigation revealed a picture consistent with what friends and family had reported. Mercedes appeared to be living a normal, healthy life with typical social media activities and no signs of dangerous or concerning online interactions. Her digital footprint showed someone who was engaged with friends, family, and work activities, but not involved in anything that would obviously put her at risk. As months passed without significant developments, the investigation began to focus on the possibility that Mercedes's disappearance might have been the result of a chance encounter with a dangerous individual. Phoenix's position as a major metropolitan area along significant transportation corridors means that it attracts transient populations, including individuals who might pose risks to public safety. The randomness suggested by this theory was both plausible and deeply troubling. If Mercedes had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when she encountered someone with violent intentions, it would explain both the lack of obvious motive and the absence of evidence connecting her disappearance to her personal life or relationships. The disappearance of Mercedes Vega resonated throughout the Phoenix community in ways that transcended her immediate circle of friends and family. Her case became a symbol of the vulnerability that urban residents face and the limitations of modern safety systems when someone simply vanishes without explanation. The response from the community revealed both the best of human nature and the deep concerns that such cases generate about public safety. Mercedes's family quickly organized efforts to maintain public awareness of her disappearance, understanding that sustained attention would be crucial for generating leads and keeping pressure on law enforcement to dedicate adequate resources to the investigation. They created social media campaigns, organized community meetings, and worked with local media outlets to ensure that Mercedes's story remained visible to the public. The family's advocacy efforts were supported by a growing network of volunteers who were moved by Mercedes's story and concerned about the implications of her disappearance for community safety. These volunteers assisted with distributing flyers, organizing search efforts, and maintaining the social media presence that kept Mercedes's case in the public eye. Their dedication demonstrated the power of community mobilization in response to tragedy. Local businesses throughout the Phoenix area participated in awareness efforts by displaying flyers with Mercedes's photograph and information about her disappearance. Restaurant owners, retail managers, and service providers understood that their customers might possess information that could help solve the case, and they were willing to use their businesses as platforms for spreading awareness about the investigation. The case attracted attention from missing person advocacy organizations, which brought additional resources and expertise to the search efforts. These organizations, staffed by people who had experience with similar cases or who had been affected by disappearances of their own family members, provided both practical assistance and emotional support to Mercedes's family. Phoenix area universities and colleges became involved in awareness efforts, recognizing that Mercedes's disappearance raised concerns about the safety of young adults living independently in urban areas. Campus safety presentations began incorporating information about Mercedes's case as an example of how someone could vanish despite taking reasonable precautions and maintaining normal communication patterns with friends and family. The Hispanic community in Phoenix, of which Mercedes was a part, responded with particular intensity to her disappearance. Community leaders organized prayer vigils, coordinated search efforts, and worked to ensure that language barriers did not prevent potential witnesses from sharing information with investigators. The cultural connections within the community became a resource for spreading awareness and generating support for the search efforts. Local law enforcement agencies beyond the Phoenix Police Department became involved in the investigation as it became clear that Mercedes's disappearance might have regional implications. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, which has jurisdiction over many of the desert areas surrounding Phoenix, coordinated search efforts and provided specialized resources for examining remote locations where evidence might be found. The case generated discussion about the unique challenges of investigating disappearances in rapidly growing metropolitan areas like Phoenix. The city's sprawling geography, diverse population, and position along major transportation corridors create complex environments for law enforcement, where people can vanish into urban anonymity or desert vastness with equal ease. Mercedes's disappearance also highlighted concerns about the safety of young women living independently in major metropolitan areas. Her case became part of broader discussions about personal safety, awareness of surroundings, and the limitations of security systems in preventing random acts of violence or predatory behavior. The Phoenix media's coverage of Mercedes's case demonstrated both the importance of sustained attention and the challenges of maintaining public interest in cases that lack dramatic developments. News outlets balanced their responsibility to keep the case visible with the practical limitations of covering a story that generated few new leads or significant investigative breakthroughs. Social media played a crucial role in maintaining awareness of Mercedes's disappearance, with hashtags and sharing campaigns that reached far beyond the Phoenix area. The viral nature of social media meant that information about Mercedes's case spread to other states and regions, potentially reaching people who might have encountered her or witnessed something relevant to her disappearance. The investigation's lack of progress began to generate criticism of law enforcement's response, though investigators maintained that they were pursuing all available leads and dedicating significant resources to the case. The tension between public expectations for quick resolution and the practical realities of investigating complex disappearances became a secondary story that complicated efforts to maintain focus on finding Mercedes. Mercedes's case became part of the broader conversation about missing persons of color and the attention that such cases receive from media and law enforcement. Advocates argued that cases involving young women from minority communities often receive less attention and fewer resources than similar cases involving white victims, making sustained community advocacy even more important. The emotional toll of the prolonged search began to affect everyone involved in the efforts to find Mercedes. Family members, friends, volunteers, and investigators all struggled with the frustration of continued uncertainty and the growing fear that Mercedes might never be found alive. The psychological impact of such cases extends far beyond the immediate victim to affect entire communities. As the investigation approached its 6-month mark without significant breakthroughs, the reality of Mercedes's case as a long-term mystery began to set in. The transition from active search to sustained investigation represented a difficult acknowledgement that quick resolution was unlikely, while the commitment to finding answers remained unchanged. The case study that Mercedes's disappearance represented became useful for law enforcement training and community education programs. Her story illustrated both the vulnerabilities that exist in modern urban life and the importance of community response when someone vanishes without explanation. As the investigation into Mercedes Vega's disappearance continued without breakthrough developments, investigators and the community began to grapple with various theories about what might have happened to her. Each potential explanation brought its own set of implications and investigative challenges, while the absence of concrete evidence made it impossible to definitively pursue any single theory. The random crime theory remained one of the most plausible explanations for Mercedes's disappearance. Phoenix, like other major metropolitan areas, experiences various forms of violent crime, and the possibility that Mercedes had encountered a dangerous individual through pure chance was both statistically reasonable and deeply troubling. This theory suggested that she might have been the victim of a carjacking, kidnapping, or other violent crime committed by someone with no previous connection to her. Supporting the random crime theory was the complete absence of obvious motives related to Mercedes's personal life. Investigators had found no evidence of threatening relationships, financial problems, involvement in dangerous activities, or other factors that might have made her a specific target. The randomness of such an encounter would explain both the lack of warning signs and the absence of evidence connecting her disappearance to her known associates. However, the random crime theory also presented significant challenges for the investigation. If Mercedes had indeed been the victim of a chance encounter with a dangerous individual, finding evidence would depend largely on luck, witness testimony, or the perpetrator making mistakes that led to their identification. The vast geography of the Phoenix area meant that evidence could be hidden in countless locations, making systematic searches extremely difficult. The human trafficking theory emerged as another possibility that investigators had to consider seriously. Phoenix's position along major transportation corridors and its proximity to the Mexican border make it a significant hub for various forms of illegal trafficking. The possibility that Mercedes might have been abducted for trafficking purposes was particularly concerning because it would suggest that she could have been moved far from the Phoenix area quickly after her disappearance. Evidence supporting the trafficking theory was largely circumstantial, based on patterns observed in other cases rather than specific evidence related to Mercedes's disappearance. Her age, appearance, and circumstances made her a potential target for traffickers, but there were no witnesses, communications, or other direct evidence suggesting that trafficking was involved in her case. The voluntary disappearance theory, while less likely given Mercedes's character and circumstances, remained a possibility that investigators had to explore. Some missing person cases are eventually resolved when individuals are found to have deliberately left their previous lives behind for various personal reasons. However, this theory was not well supported by evidence in Mercedes's case. Mercedes's financial accounts remained untouched, her personal belongings remained in her apartment, and her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance showed no signs of someone planning to leave. Her relationships with family and friends were strong, her professional situation was stable, and she had various commitments and future plans that suggested she was not contemplating disappearing from her life. The accidental death theory considered the possibility that Mercedes might have been involved in an accident that removed her and her vehicle from easy detection. The desert area surrounding Phoenix contained various hazards including remote washes, abandoned mine shafts, and other geographical features where accidents could occur without immediate discovery. However, this theory struggled to explain how both Mercedes and her vehicle could have been involved in an accident that left no trace. Modern vehicles contain numerous safety and communication systems that make complete disappearance due to accidents less likely, and the systematic searches of desert areas had not revealed any evidence supporting the accidental death theory. Investigators also explored the possibility that Mercedes's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved cases in the Phoenix area or beyond. They analyzed patterns of similar disappearances, looking for commonalities in timing, location, victim characteristics, or methods that might suggest a serial offender was operating in the region. This analysis revealed that Mercedes's case shared some characteristics with other unsolved disappearances, but the connections were not strong enough to definitively link the cases. The possibility of a serial offender remained under consideration, but without more concrete evidence connecting the cases, it remained speculative rather than a clear investigative direction. The domestic violence theory was explored despite the absence of obvious indicators, because such violence is unfortunately common in cases involving missing women. Investigators examined Mercedes's past relationships looking for signs of threatening behavior, stalking, or other indicators that someone from her personal life might have posed a danger to her. This investigation revealed that while Mercedes had experienced typical relationship difficulties, there were no clear signs of domestic violence or threatening behavior from current or former romantic partners. The theory was not completely eliminated, but it was not well supported by available evidence. The witness protection or law enforcement connection theory emerged from speculation about whether Mercedes might have been involved in situations that required her to be relocated for safety reasons. However, investigation revealed no evidence that Mercedes had been involved in criminal cases as a witness or that she had any connections to law enforcement activities that might have required protective measures. As each theory was explored and found lacking in supporting evidence, the investigation began to focus more heavily on the possibility that Mercedes's disappearance represented a particularly well-concealed crime. The absence of evidence, rather than being merely frustrating, began to be seen as potentially significant in itself, suggesting either sophisticated criminal activity or circumstances that were particularly effective at concealing evidence. The psychological impact of pursuing multiple theories without resolution began to affect everyone involved in the investigation. The uncertainty created by having multiple plausible explanations, none of which could be definitively proven or disproven, generated a particular kind of frustration that is common in complex missing person cases. Family members, friends, investigators, and community volunteers all struggled with the absence of clear direction for their efforts. The passage of time began to work against the investigation in ways that are unfortunately common in missing person cases. Physical evidence, if it existed, became increasingly difficult to detect as weather conditions and natural processes worked to conceal or destroy traces of human activity. Witnesses' memories became less reliable, and the urgency that had initially driven intensive search efforts began to give way to the recognition that Mercedes's case might require long-term investigation rather than quick resolution. The media attention that had initially helped spread awareness of Mercedes's disappearance began to wane as other stories competed for public attention and the case failed to generate new developments that would sustain journalistic interest. The family and advocates worked continuously to maintain visibility for Mercedes's case, understanding that sustained public awareness would be crucial for generating new leads and maintaining investigative momentum. The impact of Mercedes Vega's disappearance extended far beyond her immediate circle of family and friends, creating ripple effects throughout the Phoenix community that highlighted the interconnected nature of urban life and the ways that single traumatic events can reshape entire communities' sense of safety and security. Mercedes's apartment complex experienced immediate changes in the wake of her disappearance. Residents who had previously felt secure in the building's amenities and security features began to question whether such measures were adequate protection against the kind of threat that had apparently claimed Mercedes. The parking garage, once seen as a convenient and safe feature, became a source of anxiety for residents who could not help but think of Mercedes every time they walked to their vehicles. Building management responded to residents' concerns by upgrading security systems, increasing lighting in common areas, and implementing additional safety protocols. However, these improvements could not address the fundamental uncertainty about what had actually happened to Mercedes, leaving residents to navigate their daily routines with an increased awareness of their vulnerability. The restaurant where Mercedes had planned to meet her friends became an unintentional memorial site, as friends and family members occasionally gathered there to remember her and maintain their connection to the last evening she had planned to enjoy. The staff, who had learned about Mercedes's story through media coverage, reported that the case had made them more aware of customers who might be waiting for someone who would never arrive. Mercedes's friends struggled with complex feelings of guilt and helplessness as they processed their role in the events of April 17. They questioned whether they should have acted sooner when Mercedes failed to arrive, whether they might have done something differently that could have prevented her disappearance, and how to maintain hope while preparing for the possibility that she might never be found. The young professional community in Phoenix, of which Mercedes had been a part, experienced a collective loss of innocence as they realized that someone with circumstances similar to their own could simply vanish without explanation. The case became a frequent topic of conversation at social gatherings, professional events, and casual encounters, as people tried to understand how to protect themselves from threats they could not identify or predict. Safety behaviors began to change throughout the community as people adjusted their routines in response to Mercedes's disappearance. More people began sharing their travel plans with friends and family, using location-sharing features on their phones, and avoiding traveling alone when possible. These changes represented rational responses to increased awareness of personal vulnerability, but they also reflected a diminished sense of freedom and security. The Hispanic community in Phoenix felt Mercedes's disappearance particularly acutely, as it reinforced concerns about the safety of young women and the adequacy of law enforcement response to cases involving minority victims. Community leaders used Mercedes's case to advocate for increased resources for missing person investigations and greater attention to cases that might otherwise receive insufficient publicity or investigative priority. Mercedes's workplace experienced its own form of trauma as colleagues struggled to understand how someone they saw regularly could simply disappear. The empty desk, the unreturned emails, and the ongoing uncertainty about Mercedes's fate created a persistent reminder of life's fragility and unpredictability. Coworkers reported difficulty concentrating on routine tasks while wondering what had happened to their colleague. The investigation's impact on law enforcement resources became significant as months passed without resolution. The Phoenix Police Department continued to dedicate personnel and resources to Mercedes's case, but the demands of other investigations and the practical limitations of pursuing leads without clear evidence began to create challenges for sustained intensive investigation. The case became a teaching tool for law enforcement training programs, illustrating both the challenges of investigating disappearances in large metropolitan areas and the importance of community cooperation in missing person cases. Mercedes's story was used to help officers understand the long-term impacts of such cases on families and communities, and the importance of maintaining hope and investigative momentum even when cases resist quick resolution. As we conclude this examination of Mercedes Vega's disappearance, more than a year has passed since that April evening when she left her apartment to meet friends for dinner and instead vanished into the vast landscape of metropolitan Phoenix. Her case remains active, her family continues to search for answers, and her community continues to hope for resolution while learning to live with the uncertainty that her disappearance has created. The investigation into Mercedes's case continues, though it has evolved from the intensive initial search efforts to the more methodical, long-term approach that characterizes cold cases. Investigators continue to follow up on tips, analyze new evidence as it becomes available, and look for connections to other cases that might provide insights into what happened to Mercedes. Her family has established a foundation in Mercedes's name, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for improved resources for missing person investigations. Through their advocacy work, they have found a way to channel their grief and frustration into constructive action that honors Mercedes's memory while potentially helping other families facing similar tragedies. The community response to Mercedes's disappearance has evolved into sustained awareness rather than acute crisis response. Her photograph remains displayed in businesses throughout Phoenix, her case continues to be featured in local media outlets, and the social media campaigns that began in the first days after her disappearance continue to reach new audiences who might possess relevant information. Mercedes's story has become part of the collective memory of Phoenix, a reminder of both the vulnerabilities that exist in modern urban life and the strength of community response when someone in need of help cannot help themselves. Her case illustrates the ways that individual tragedies become shared experiences that shape entire communities' understanding of safety, risk, and mutual responsibility. The desert that surrounds Phoenix continues to hold its secrets, and somewhere in the vast landscape of the American Southwest, answers to the questions surrounding Mercedes's disappearance may still be waiting to be discovered. Her case remains a testament to the persistence of mystery in an age of digital connectivity and comprehensive surveillance, a reminder that even in our highly documented world, people can still vanish without explanation. As we reflect on Mercedes Vega's story, we remember a young woman who was building a life filled with friendships, goals, and possibilities in one of America's most dynamic cities. We honor her memory by continuing to search for answers, supporting her family's ongoing efforts to find truth, and maintaining the hope that someday, the mystery of her disappearance will be resolved. The investigation continues. The search goes on. And somewhere, Mercedes Vega's story awaits its conclusion. If you have any information about the disappearance of Mercedes Vega or similar cases, please contact the Phoenix Police Department or your local law enforcement agency. Every tip, no matter how small it might seem, could be the key to bringing someone home. I honestly want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey into the affluent neighborhood of Ascot Estates in Irmo, South Carolina, a place where manicured lawns and pristine homes create an illusion of safety and prosperity. But beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, a web of deception, gambling, and greed was slowly tightening around the lives of ordinary people who had no idea they were walking toward tragedy. This is the story of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst, two individuals whose lives became entangled in a dangerous world of illegal sports betting, mounting debts, and desperate schemes. It's a tale that begins with the American dream of success and security, but transforms into something far darker when those dreams become nightmares of financial ruin and moral compromise. On a quiet Friday the 13th in April 2012, the peaceful streets of Ascot Estates would be shattered by the sound of gunshots that would echo through the community for years to come. What appeared at first to be a tragic case of self-defense would slowly unravel to reveal a carefully orchestrated plot born from desperation, greed, and the dangerous belief that some problems can be solved through violence. As we unfold this story together, we'll explore how ordinary people can become trapped in extraordinary circumstances, how the pursuit of easy money can lead to impossible choices, and how the bonds of marriage and business partnership can become threads in a web of deception that ultimately destroys everyone it touches. Settle in as we journey through this tale of hidden debts, secret affairs, and the terrible price paid when someone decides that murder is preferable to facing the consequences of their actions. Ascot Estates was the kind of neighborhood that represented everything the American middle class aspired to achieve. Located in Irmo, South Carolina, this upscale community was home to successful professionals, business owners, and families who had worked hard to build comfortable lives for themselves and their children. The streets were lined with well-maintained homes, each one a testament to the dreams and ambitions of the families who lived within them. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks, neighbors chatted over fence lines, and the biggest concerns seemed to revolve around property values and the quality of local schools. It was in this setting that Brett and Tammy Jo Parker had built what appeared to be an enviable life. Their home on Taqueria Trail was a beautiful representation of suburban success, spacious, well-appointed, and situated in a neighborhood where such homes were symbols of achievement and stability. Brett Parker was a man who seemed to have it all figured out. In his 40s, he presented himself as a successful businessman with interests in various ventures. He had the confidence and charisma that often accompanies financial success, and he moved through his community with the ease of someone who belonged in places of comfort and privilege. Tammy Jo Parker, 44 years old, was his wife and partner in building their life together. She was a woman who had embraced the role of suburban wife and mother, creating a home that served as a sanctuary for her family and a gathering place for friends and neighbors. Those who knew Tammy Jo remembered her as someone who cared deeply about the people in her life and took pride in the home and family she had helped create. The Parkers' marriage appeared solid from the outside. They had navigated the challenges that all couples face, the pressures of building careers, raising children, and maintaining a household in an expensive neighborhood. To their neighbors and acquaintances, they seemed like any other successful couple who had found their place in the world and were enjoying the fruits of their labor. But beneath this picture of domestic harmony, fault lines were beginning to develop that would eventually tear apart not just their marriage, but their entire world. Brett Parker was harboring secrets that would have shocked those who knew him as a respectable businessman and family man. The truth was that Brett had become deeply involved in illegal sports betting operations. What had likely begun as a side venture or perhaps even a hobby had evolved into a significant part of his financial life. He was operating as a bookie, taking bets from clients and managing the kind of operation that existed in the shadows of legitimate business. For many people, the world of sports betting represents harmless entertainment, a way to add excitement to watching games and potentially make some extra money. But for those who operate on the other side of the equation, taking bets and managing operations, the stakes are much higher and the risks much more serious. Brett had built a network of clients who placed bets through him on various sporting events. This wasn't the casual betting that takes place between friends watching a game. This was a sophisticated operation that involved significant amounts of money, complex odds calculations, and the kind of financial exposure that could make or break someone's livelihood. The business was lucrative when things went well, but it also carried enormous risks. When bettors won big, Brett was responsible for paying out those winnings. When the bets fell in his favor, he collected the money and kept his profits. But the nature of gambling meant that there were always periods when the payouts exceeded the income, and those periods could create serious financial pressure. As Brett's involvement in the betting operation deepened, he began to accumulate debts that were far beyond what his legitimate income could support. The amounts involved weren't the kind of debts that could be managed through conventional financial planning or even bankruptcy proceedings. These were debts to people who expected to be paid, and who had their own methods of ensuring collection. The stress of managing these financial pressures began to affect Brett in ways that weren't immediately apparent to those around him. He maintained his outward appearance of success and stability, but internally he was dealing with the constant anxiety that comes with being in debt to dangerous people and operating in a world where the consequences of failure could be severe. Tammy Jo, meanwhile, was unaware of the full extent of her husband's involvement in illegal gambling operations. She may have known that Brett was involved in sports betting to some degree, but she likely had no idea how deep his involvement had become or how much money was at stake. The comfortable life they had built together was being funded, at least in part, by activities that could destroy everything they had worked for. As the months passed, the pressure on Brett continued to mount. The debts were growing, and the people to whom he owed money were becoming increasingly impatient. The comfortable life in Ascot Estates was beginning to feel like a facade that was becoming harder and harder to maintain. Into this increasingly tense situation came Brian Kapnerhurst, a man whose life would become tragically intertwined with the Parkers in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Brian Kapnerhurst was 46 years old when his path crossed with Brett Parker's in the world of illegal sports betting. Like Brett, Brian appeared to be a respectable member of his community, someone who had built a life around family, work, and the pursuit of financial stability. But also like Brett, Brian had become involved in activities that existed outside the boundaries of conventional business. Brian was married to Cindy, and together they had built a life that, from the outside, looked much like the lives of many other middle-class couples. They had their own financial goals and dreams, their own challenges and pressures, and their own hopes for the future. What they also had, unfortunately, was their own set of debts and financial pressures that had led Brian to become involved in Brett's betting operation. The relationship between Brett and Brian was complex, existing somewhere between business partnership and mutual dependence. They were both involved in the same illegal gambling network, but their roles and the nature of their involvement created a dynamic that was both collaborative and potentially adversarial. Brian served as one of Brett's key associates in the betting operation. He helped facilitate bets, managed relationships with certain clients, and shared in both the profits and the risks that came with the territory. This wasn't a casual arrangement between friends, it was a serious business relationship that involved significant amounts of money and considerable legal and financial exposure. The partnership between Brett and Brian worked well when things were going smoothly. They complemented each other's skills and connections, and together they were able to operate a more sophisticated and profitable operation than either could have managed alone. But the nature of their business meant that there were always periods of stress and tension, times when the financial pressures threatened to overwhelm their ability to manage the operation. As their involvement in the betting operation deepened, both Brett and Brian began to accumulate debts that were far beyond their ability to pay through conventional means. These weren't debts to banks or credit card companies that could be negotiated or restructured. These were debts to other people involved in the gambling world, people who had their own financial pressures and their own methods of ensuring collection. The debt situation was particularly acute for Brett, who found himself owing money to Brian and others in amounts that would have been shocking to those who knew him as a successful businessman. The exact figures were staggering, amounts that represented more than most people's annual salaries, amounts that couldn't be paid off through normal financial planning or even through the sale of assets. Brian, meanwhile, was dealing with his own financial pressures. His involvement in the betting operation had created debts and obligations that were affecting his ability to maintain his own lifestyle and meet his own financial responsibilities. His wife Cindy was aware of some of these pressures, but like Tammy Jo Parker, she likely didn't understand the full extent of how deep her husband's involvement had become. The relationship between Brett and Brian began to show signs of strain as the financial pressures mounted. What had started as a mutually beneficial partnership was becoming a source of tension and conflict as both men struggled to manage their obligations and maintain their operations. Brian was owed money by Brett, significant amounts that represented crucial income for Brian's own financial stability. But Brett was also owed money by Brian in other contexts, creating a complex web of financial obligations that neither man could easily untangle. The situation was becoming increasingly unsustainable, and both men were beginning to realize that their involvement in the betting operation was creating problems that were beyond their ability to solve through conventional means. The stress of managing these financial pressures was affecting both men's relationships with their families. Brian's marriage to Cindy was being strained by the financial uncertainty and the secrecy that surrounded Brian's business activities. Cindy could see that her husband was under enormous pressure, but she may not have understood the full scope of the situation they were facing. Similarly, Brett's marriage to Tammy Jo was being affected by the stress and secrecy that surrounded his business activities. Tammy Jo could see that her husband was dealing with significant pressure, but she may not have realized that their entire lifestyle was being funded by activities that could result in criminal charges and financial ruin. As the months passed, the situation continued to deteriorate. The debts were growing, the pressure was mounting, and both Brett and Brian were beginning to realize that they were trapped in a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The comfortable lives they had built for themselves and their families were being threatened by their involvement in activities that they had initially seen as opportunities for easy money. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything, a meeting that was intended to resolve their financial difficulties but would instead result in tragedy that would destroy multiple families and shock the quiet community of Ascot Estates. While Brett Parker was struggling with mounting gambling debts and the pressure of managing his illegal betting operation, he was also dealing with another complication that would prove significant in the events to come. He was having an extramarital affair. The woman's name was Lindsay Mullins, and her relationship with Brett represented another layer of deception in a life that was already built on increasingly unstable foundations. Affairs often develop when people are under stress, seeking escape from the pressures of their daily lives, or looking for emotional connection that they feel is missing from their marriages. For Brett, the affair with Lindsay may have represented all of these things. Lindsay would later testify about her relationship with Brett, providing insights into his state of mind and the pressures he was facing during the months leading up to the tragic events of April 13, 2012. Her testimony would reveal a man who was struggling with enormous financial pressure, who was seeking escape from the mounting problems in his life, and who was beginning to consider desperate measures to solve his problems. The affair with Lindsay was significant not just because it represented a betrayal of his marriage to Tammy Jo, but because it provided evidence of Brett's willingness to deceive those closest to him. If he was capable of maintaining an elaborate deception with his wife, lying to her about his whereabouts and his emotional attachments, then he was certainly capable of deceiving her about other aspects of his life. Tammy Jo, meanwhile, was largely unaware of the extent of her husband's deceptions. She may have sensed that something was wrong, may have noticed changes in Brett's behavior or mood, but she likely had no idea that her husband was living a double life that involved both illegal gambling operations and an extramarital affair. The strain of maintaining these deceptions was enormous. Brett was juggling multiple sets of obligations and relationships, each requiring different versions of himself, each demanding attention and energy that he was struggling to provide. The cognitive load of maintaining such an elaborate set of lies was exhausting, and the psychological pressure was building toward a breaking point. As the financial pressures mounted, Brett began to explore options that went far beyond conventional solutions to debt problems. He wasn't just looking for ways to pay off his debts, he was looking for ways to completely escape from the situation he had created. The amounts he owed were so large that conventional solutions like bankruptcy or asset liquidation wouldn't come close to resolving his problems. It was during this period that Brett began to develop what would later be revealed as a sophisticated plan to solve his financial problems through insurance fraud. He had life insurance policies on his wife Tammy Jo that totaled more than $1 million, and he began to consider whether her death might provide a solution to his financial difficulties. The insurance policies were significant not just because of their size, but because of their potential to provide Brett with the kind of money that could pay off his debts and allow him to start over with a clean slate. The policies represented more money than Brett could realistically expect to earn through legitimate means in the foreseeable future, and they offered a tempting solution to problems that seemed otherwise unsolvable. The development of this plan represented a fundamental shift in Brett's thinking. He was no longer just someone who had gotten in over his head with gambling debts, he was someone who was actively planning to commit murder for financial gain. The psychological journey from desperate debtor to potential murderer was a gradual one, but it was accelerated by the mounting pressure and the apparent lack of alternative solutions. The plan that Brett was developing was sophisticated and required careful timing and execution. He couldn't simply kill his wife and expect to collect the insurance money without raising suspicions. He needed to create a scenario that would make her death appear to be the result of circumstances beyond his control, something that would allow him to collect the insurance money while avoiding suspicion. As Brett's plan developed, Brian Kapnerhurst became an increasingly important figure in the scenario. Brian was owed money by Brett, and his demand for payment was creating additional pressure on an already desperate situation. But Brian's involvement in the betting operation also made him a potential liability, someone who knew too much about Brett's illegal activities and financial situation. The relationship between Brett and Brian was becoming increasingly tense as the financial pressures mounted. Brian needed the money that Brett owed him, but Brett was unable to pay. The situation was creating conflict between the two men, and their business relationship was deteriorating under the strain of their financial difficulties. It was in this context of mounting pressure, desperate circumstances, and deteriorating relationships that Brett began to finalize his plan for April 13, 2012. The plan would involve both Tammy Jo and Brian, and it would result in a tragedy that would shock the community and expose the web of deception that Brett had been weaving for months. Friday, April 13, 2012, dawned like any other day in the quiet neighborhood of Ascot Estates. The spring morning was pleasant, with the kind of weather that made suburban life feel peaceful and comfortable. Children were preparing for school, adults were getting ready for work, and the routine rhythms of daily life were beginning to unfold across the community. For Tammy Jo Parker, the day likely began much like any other. She may have had plans for the weekend, perhaps social activities with friends or family obligations that she was looking forward to. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Friday would be the last day of her life, or that the comfortable home she had worked so hard to create would become the scene of a violent crime. Brett Parker was also going through the motions of a normal day, but for him, April 13th was anything but ordinary. This was the day he had chosen to implement the plan he had been developing for weeks or perhaps months. Everything had to go perfectly, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The plan that Brett had developed was complex and required precise timing. He had arranged for Brian Kapnerhurst to come to the house that day, ostensibly to collect $20,000 that Brett owed him from their gambling operations. This meeting was presented as a routine business transaction, the kind of financial settlement that occurred regularly in their world of illegal sports betting. But Brett's true intentions for the meeting were far more sinister. He had decided that both Tammy Jo and Brian represented obstacles to his plan to escape his financial difficulties through insurance fraud. Tammy Jo's death would provide him with the insurance money he needed, but Brian's knowledge of Brett's illegal activities made him a potential liability that needed to be eliminated. The scenario that Brett was planning to create was one of self-defense. He would claim that Brian had come to the house with violent intentions, that he had threatened or attacked Tammy Jo, and that Brett had been forced to shoot Brian to protect his wife. But in the struggle, Tammy Jo would also be killed, leaving Brett as the sole survivor and the beneficiary of her life insurance policies. It was a plan that required Brett to kill two people he knew well, people who trusted him and had no reason to suspect that he was capable of such violence. The psychological preparation required to carry out such a plan was enormous, and it revealed the extent to which Brett's thinking had become distorted by his desperate circumstances. As the morning progressed, Brett began to put his plan into motion. He would later claim that Brian had arrived at the house armed and with violent intentions, but the evidence would suggest a very different scenario. The reality was that Brian had come to the house for a routine business meeting, expecting to collect money that was owed to him and to conduct the kind of transaction that he and Brett had handled many times before. The meeting was scheduled for a time when Brett and Brian would be alone in the house with Tammy Jo. This timing was crucial to Brett's plan, as it would allow him to carry out the killings without witnesses and to create the scenario he needed to claim self-defense. When Brian arrived at the house on Taqueria Trail, he had no idea that he was walking into a trap. He trusted Brett as a business partner and had no reason to suspect that Brett was capable of violence. The routine nature of their business relationship had created a sense of familiarity and comfort that made Brian vulnerable to Brett's deception. What happened next would be the subject of extensive investigation and legal proceedings. According to the evidence that would later be presented in court, Brett killed both Tammy Jo and Brian using two different guns that he owned. The shootings were not the result of a struggle or self-defense, they were deliberate executions carried out as part of Brett's plan to solve his financial problems through murder and insurance fraud. Tammy Jo Parker, 44 years old, was shot multiple times in her own home, killed by the husband she had trusted and loved. The woman who had worked to create a comfortable life for her family was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible, murdered by someone who had promised to love and protect her. Brian Kapnerhurst, 46 years old, was also shot multiple times, killed by someone he had considered a business partner and friend. The man who had come to collect money that was owed to him was instead met with violence that ended his life and left his family devastated. The scene that Brett created in his home was one of shocking violence. Two people who had started the day with normal expectations and routine plans were dead, victims of a carefully planned double murder that was motivated by greed and desperation. But Brett's plan was far from perfect, and the evidence he left behind would eventually expose the truth about what had happened in the house on Taqueria Trail. The investigation that would follow would reveal the web of deception, debt, and desperation that had led to this tragic outcome. The quiet neighborhood of Ascot Estates was shattered by the sound of gunshots on that Friday afternoon, and within minutes, the peaceful community was transformed into a crime scene that would capture the attention of law enforcement, media, and the public. The first responders who arrived at the Parker home were confronted with a scene of devastating violence. Two people were dead, shot multiple times in what appeared to be a brutal attack. The victims were identified as Tammy Jo Parker, the 44-year-old wife and mother who had been killed in her own home, and Brian Kapnerhurst, the 46-year-old business associate who had come to the house for what should have been a routine meeting. Brett Parker was the sole survivor of the incident, and his initial account of what had happened formed the foundation of the investigation. He told investigators that Brian Kapnerhurst had come to the house to collect money from their sports betting operation, but that the meeting had turned violent when Brian became aggressive and threatening. According to Brett's version of events, Brian had arrived at the house armed and with violent intentions. Brett claimed that Brian had threatened or attacked Tammy Jo, and that he had been forced to shoot Brian in self-defense. In the struggle that followed, Brett said, Tammy Jo had also been shot and killed. The story that Brett told was designed to portray him as a victim of circumstances, a man who had been forced to defend his home and family against a violent intruder. He presented himself as someone who had acted in self-defense, someone who had been trying to protect his wife when tragedy had struck. But as investigators began to examine the scene and the evidence, inconsistencies in Brett's account began to emerge. The physical evidence at the crime scene didn't match the story that Brett was telling, and the investigation began to reveal a very different picture of what had happened in the house on Taqueria Trail. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was the fact that both victims had been shot with two different guns, both of which belonged to Brett. This detail was inconsistent with Brett's claim of self-defense, as it suggested a level of premeditation and planning that didn't fit with his account of a spontaneous struggle. The pattern of gunshot wounds on both victims also raised questions about Brett's version of events. The evidence suggested that both Tammy Jo and Brian had been shot multiple times, with wounds that were consistent with deliberate execution rather than the chaotic violence that might be expected in a self-defense situation. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement began to uncover the complex web of financial relationships, gambling debts, and illegal activities that had connected Brett and Brian. The sports betting operation that Brett had been running from his home was revealed to be a sophisticated illegal enterprise that had generated significant amounts of money but had also created enormous financial liabilities. The investigation revealed that Brett owed substantial amounts of money to various people involved in the gambling operation, including Brian Kapnerhurst. The debts were far beyond Brett's ability to pay through conventional means, and the pressure to settle these debts had been mounting for months. Investigators also discovered the life insurance policies that Brett had on his wife Tammy Jo, policies that totaled more than $1 million and would have provided Brett with a substantial financial windfall in the event of her death. The existence of these policies, combined with Brett's mounting gambling debts, began to paint a picture of a man who might have been motivated by financial gain rather than self-defense. The investigation also revealed Brett's extramarital affair with Lindsay Mullins, adding another layer of complexity to the case. The affair provided evidence of Brett's willingness to deceive his wife and suggested that he might have been motivated by a desire to escape his marriage as well as his financial difficulties. As more evidence was uncovered, the picture that emerged was one of a carefully planned double murder motivated by greed, desperation, and a desire to escape the consequences of Brett's illegal activities. The investigation revealed that Brett had not acted in self-defense, but had instead deliberately killed both his wife and Brian Kapnerhurst as part of a scheme to collect insurance money and eliminate potential witnesses to his illegal activities. The community of Ascot Estates was shocked by the revelations about Brett Parker and the double murder that had occurred in their neighborhood. The man who had seemed like a successful businessman and family man was revealed to be someone capable of planning and executing the murder of his own wife and business partner. The investigation also revealed the extent of the illegal gambling operation that Brett had been running from his home. At least 14 people were eventually charged in connection with the betting ring, demonstrating the scope and sophistication of the illegal enterprise that had been operating in the quiet suburban neighborhood. As the evidence mounted against Brett Parker, it became clear that his initial account of self-defense was not credible. The physical evidence, the financial motives, and the pattern of the crimes all pointed to a deliberate and premeditated double murder that had been carried out for financial gain. The case against Brett Parker was built on a foundation of physical evidence, financial records, and witness testimony that painted a devastating picture of premeditated murder motivated by greed and desperation. As the case moved through the legal system, the full scope of Brett's deception and the carefully planned nature of his crimes became clear. The prosecution's case was comprehensive and methodical, designed to dismantle Brett's claim of self-defense and reveal the true nature of the crimes he had committed. Prosecutors argued that the shootings on April 13, 2012, were part of a calculated plan for Brett to collect more than $1 million in insurance money to pay off his gambling debts and escape from his marriage to Tammy Jo. The evidence presented at trial included detailed forensic analysis of the crime scene, financial records that revealed the extent of Brett's gambling debts, and testimony from witnesses who could speak to Brett's state of mind and the pressures he was facing in the months leading up to the murders. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence against Brett was the fact that both victims had been shot with two different guns, both of which belonged to him. This evidence was inconsistent with his claim of self-defense and suggested a level of premeditation that undermined his entire version of events. The prosecution also presented evidence about the life insurance policies that Brett had on his wife, policies that would have provided him with more than $1 million in the event of her death. The timing and circumstances of these policies, combined with Brett's mounting gambling debts, provided a clear financial motive for the murder. Testimony from Lindsay Mullins, Brett's former mistress, provided additional insights into his state of mind and the pressures he was facing. Her testimony revealed a man who was struggling with enormous financial pressure and who was actively seeking ways to escape from his difficult circumstances. The prosecution also presented evidence about Brett's illegal gambling operation, demonstrating that he was deeply involved in activities that could have resulted in serious criminal charges and financial ruin. The operation had generated significant amounts of money but had also created enormous liabilities that Brett was unable to manage. Brian Kapnerhurst's widow, Cindy, provided emotional testimony about the impact of her husband's death on their family. Her testimony revealed the extent of the debts that Brian had accumulated through his involvement in the gambling operation, but also made clear that he had not been involved in any violent or threatening behavior that would have justified his murder. The defense attempted to maintain Brett's claim of self-defense, arguing that he had acted to protect himself and his wife when Brian Kapnerhurst became violent and threatening. The defense team tried to paint a picture of Brett as a victim of circumstances who had been forced to take violent action to protect his family. However, the defense's arguments were undermined by the physical evidence and the financial circumstances that provided clear motives for the murders. The defense was unable to explain away the evidence of premeditation, the financial motives, or the inconsistencies in Brett's account of what had happened. The defense also faced challenges in explaining Brett's illegal gambling operation and the extent of his financial difficulties. The evidence of Brett's involvement in illegal activities made it difficult to portray him as a sympathetic victim of circumstances. South Carolina's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force in self-defense under certain circumstances, was not available to Brett as a defense. The law requires that the person claiming self-defense not be engaged in unlawful activity at the time of the incident. Brett's operation of an illegal gambling ring from his home disqualified him from claiming protection under the law. The trial lasted several weeks and included testimony from numerous witnesses, including law enforcement officers, forensic experts, financial analysts, and people who had been involved in Brett's gambling operation. The evidence presented was overwhelming and painted a clear picture of premeditated murder motivated by financial gain. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching their verdict. Brett Parker was found guilty on 2 counts of murder, one for each of his victims. The speed of the jury's deliberation suggested that they found the evidence against Brett to be compelling and his claims of self-defense to be not credible. The conviction represented a victory for justice and provided some measure of closure for the families of the victims. Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst had been killed by someone they trusted, and the legal system had held their killer accountable for his crimes. Judge DeAndrea Benjamin sentenced Brett Parker to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crimes. The sentence reflected the serious nature of the murders and the calculated way in which they had been carried out. The impact of Brett Parker's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating ripple effects that would change the lives of countless people and leave lasting scars on the community of Ascot Estates. The double murder had not only ended 2 lives but had also destroyed families, shattered trust, and exposed the hidden dangers that can exist beneath the surface of seemingly normal communities. Cindy Kapnerhurst, Brian's widow, found herself not only grieving the loss of her husband but also dealing with the financial devastation that his involvement in the gambling operation had created. The debts that Brian had accumulated through his business relationship with Brett had left Cindy in a precarious financial position, struggling to maintain her household and care for her family while processing the trauma of losing her husband to violence. During her testimony at Brett's trial, Cindy had revealed the extent of the financial pressures that she and Brian had been facing. The gambling operation had not brought them the financial security they had hoped for. Instead, it had created debts and obligations that were beyond their ability to manage. Brian's death had not only deprived Cindy of her husband but had also left her to deal with the financial consequences of his involvement in illegal activities. The grief that Cindy experienced was complicated by the circumstances of Brian's death. He had not died in an accident or from natural causes. He had been murdered by someone he had trusted. The betrayal involved in Brian's death added an additional layer of trauma to her loss, making the grieving process even more difficult and complex. Tammy Jo Parker's family also faced the devastating impact of her murder. She had been killed by her own husband, the man she had trusted to love and protect her. The betrayal involved in her death was profound, and her family had to process not only the loss of someone they loved but also the shocking revelation that Brett had been capable of such violence. The life insurance policies that Brett had taken out on Tammy Jo added another layer of complexity to her family's grief. The policies revealed that Brett had been planning her death for financial gain, viewing her not as a beloved wife but as a source of money that could solve his financial problems. This revelation made Tammy Jo's death even more tragic and difficult for her family to process. The children who had been part of the Parker family found themselves dealing with the loss of their mother and the knowledge that their father was a murderer. The stable family life they had known was completely destroyed, and they had to rebuild their lives while processing trauma that no child should have to endure. The community of Ascot Estates was also deeply affected by the murders. The neighborhood that had been seen as a safe and desirable place to live was revealed to be the location of a sophisticated illegal gambling operation and a double murder. The sense of security that residents had felt was shattered, and the community had to grapple with the reality that dangerous criminal activity had been operating in their midst. The house on Taqueria Trail where the murders had taken place became a symbol of the tragedy. The beautiful home that had once represented the American dream of success and security was now forever associated with violence and betrayal. The house was eventually put up for sale, but it carried with it the stigma of being a place where two people had been murdered. The investigation into the gambling operation revealed that it had been more extensive than initially realized. At least 14 people were eventually charged in connection with the betting ring, demonstrating that the illegal activity had involved a significant network of participants. The exposure of this operation led to additional legal proceedings and further disrupted the lives of those who had been involved. The case also highlighted the broader social issues related to gambling addiction and illegal gambling operations. Brett's involvement in the betting ring had started as what may have seemed like a harmless way to make extra money, but it had evolved into a dangerous criminal enterprise that ultimately led to violence and murder. The financial pressures that Brett had faced were enormous, but they were not insurmountable through legal means. Bankruptcy, asset liquidation, and other conventional approaches to debt relief could have provided him with options for addressing his financial difficulties without resorting to violence. The choice to murder his wife and business partner represented a fundamental moral failure that had devastating consequences for everyone involved. The media coverage of the case brought additional attention to the community and the families of the victims. The story of a suburban businessman who had murdered his wife and business partner for insurance money captured public attention and highlighted the dangerous potential of gambling addiction and financial desperation. For the investigators and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, the murders represented a stark reminder of how quickly seemingly normal situations can turn deadly. The officers who had responded to the scene on April 13, 2012, had been confronted with a level of violence and betrayal that was shocking even to experienced professionals. The case also had implications for the insurance industry, highlighting the potential for life insurance policies to become motives for murder. Brett's plan to collect more than $1 million from his wife's death showed how insurance policies, which are designed to provide financial security for families, can sometimes become instruments of greed and violence. The legal proceedings surrounding the gambling operation continued for months after Brett's conviction, as prosecutors worked to hold accountable all of those who had been involved in the illegal betting ring. The investigation revealed the complex web of relationships and financial obligations that had connected the participants, and the legal consequences extended far beyond Brett's murder convictions. As we near the end of this tragic story, it's important to reflect on the psychological journey that transformed Brett Parker from a seemingly successful businessman into a double murderer. Understanding this transformation doesn't excuse his actions, but it provides insight into how ordinary people can make extraordinary choices that destroy lives and communities. Brett's journey toward violence began with what may have seemed like harmless involvement in sports betting. Many people engage in casual gambling without it becoming a destructive force in their lives, but for Brett, the activity became something much more dangerous. The transition from casual bettor to illegal bookie represented a crossing of moral and legal boundaries that would have far-reaching consequences. The psychology of gambling addiction is complex, but it often involves a combination of the thrill of risk-taking, the appeal of easy money, and the gradual erosion of judgment that comes with repeated exposure to high-stakes situations. For Brett, the betting operation likely provided a sense of excitement and control that was missing from other areas of his life. As Brett's involvement in the gambling operation deepened, he began to experience the kind of financial pressure that can fundamentally alter a person's thinking. The amounts of money involved were so large that conventional solutions seemed inadequate, and the pressure from creditors was so intense that it created a sense of desperation that clouded his judgment. The affair with Lindsay Mullins represented another aspect of Brett's psychological deterioration. The willingness to betray his marriage vows and deceive his wife showed that Brett was already comfortable with lies and betrayal before he began planning murder. The affair may have also provided him with an emotional escape from the pressures of his daily life, but it also added another layer of deception that he had to maintain. The development of the murder plot represented the final stage in Brett's psychological journey toward violence. The decision to kill his wife for insurance money showed that he had come to view Tammy Jo not as a person he loved, but as a means to solve his financial problems. This dehumanization of his victim was essential to his ability to carry out the murders. The inclusion of Brian Kapnerhurst in the murder plot showed that Brett had also come to view his business partner as a liability rather than a person. Brian's knowledge of Brett's illegal activities made him a potential witness who could expose Brett's crimes, and his demand for repayment of debts created additional pressure that Brett was unable to manage. The planning and execution of the murders required Brett to overcome fundamental moral and psychological barriers that prevent most people from committing violence. The ability to plan and carry out the deliberate killing of two people he knew well showed that Brett had experienced a complete breakdown of the moral constraints that normally govern human behavior. The psychological impact of Brett's crimes extended beyond the immediate victims to include everyone who had known and trusted him. The revelation that someone they had considered a friend, neighbor, or family member was capable of such violence created lasting trauma for those who had been part of his life. As we conclude this tragic story, we're left with difficult questions about human nature, the dangers of deception, and the terrible price that can be paid when desperation overrides moral judgment. The murders of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst serve as a stark reminder that evil can exist beneath the surface of seemingly normal communities and that the people we trust most can sometimes be capable of the greatest betrayal. The quiet neighborhood of Ascot Estates has slowly healed from the trauma of April 13, 2012, but the memory of what happened there continues to serve as a cautionary tale. The beautiful homes and manicured lawns still represent the American dream of success and security, but residents are now more aware that appearances can be deceiving and that danger can exist even in the most unlikely places. For the families of the victims, the healing process continues. Cindy Kapnerhurst has had to rebuild her life without Brian, dealing with both the emotional trauma of his loss and the practical challenges of managing the financial difficulties that his involvement in the gambling operation had created. Her strength in the face of such adversity serves as an inspiration to others who have faced similar tragedies. The children and family members of Tammy Jo Parker have also had to find ways to move forward while honoring her memory. The woman who had worked so hard to create a loving home for her family is remembered not for the circumstances of her death, but for the life she lived and the love she shared with those around her. Brett Parker remains in prison, serving his 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The man who had once lived in a beautiful home in an affluent neighborhood now spends his days in a prison cell, paying the price for his terrible choices. His case serves as a reminder that no amount of financial pressure or personal difficulty can justify taking the life of another person. The story of what happened in Ascot Estates reminds us that the most dangerous deceptions are often those that we practice on ourselves. Brett's journey toward violence began with small compromises and escalated through a series of increasingly serious moral failures. The ability to recognize and address these warning signs in ourselves and others may be the key to preventing similar tragedies. As we reflect on this story, we're reminded of the importance of honesty, integrity, and moral courage in the face of difficulty. The challenges that Brett faced were serious, but they were not insurmountable through legal and ethical means. The choice to solve problems through violence and deception ultimately created far greater suffering than the original difficulties ever could have. The memory of Tammy Jo Parker and Brian Kapnerhurst serves as a reminder that every life has value and that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the immediate victims. Their deaths changed the lives of countless people and left scars on their community that may never fully heal. In the quiet hours of the night, as we consider this story, we're left with the hope that by understanding how such tragedies can occur, we might be better equipped to prevent them in the future. The price of safety and security is eternal vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the moral compromises and deceptions that can transform ordinary people into instruments of tragedy. Now let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the heart of Wisconsin, where the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus spreads like a constellation of dreams and ambition, there exists a world where young minds come to shape their futures and chase their deepest aspirations. It's a place where the energy of youth mingles with the weight of academic pursuit, where students from across the country gather to transform themselves into the doctors, teachers, lawyers, and leaders of tomorrow. This is the story of one such student, Brittany Sue Zimmerman, a 21-year-old junior who carried within her heart the noble dream of becoming a physician. She was the kind of young woman who embodied everything we hope to see in the next generation: intelligent, compassionate, dedicated, and filled with the kind of determination that transforms dreams into reality. On April 2, 2008, as spring was beginning to breathe life back into the Wisconsin landscape, Brittany was preparing for what should have been just another ordinary day in her extraordinary journey toward medical school. She had no way of knowing that this Wednesday afternoon would become the final chapter of her story, or that her desperate call for help would echo through the halls of justice for more than a decade. What unfolded in her downtown Madison apartment that day would expose not just the random cruelty that can shatter innocent lives, but also the systemic failures that can turn tragedy into something even more heartbreaking. It's a story of a young woman who fought for her life with everything she had, of a family that refused to let her memory fade into silence, and of a justice system that took 12 long years to finally provide answers. As we journey through Brittany's story together, we'll explore the bright promise of a life dedicated to healing others, the darkness that can lurk in the shadows of even the safest communities, and the devastating moment when these two worlds collided in the most tragic way possible. We'll witness how one phone call that should have brought salvation instead became evidence of a system's failure, and how the echoes of that failure would haunt a community for years to come. Brittany Sue Zimmerman was born into a world of possibilities, raised in a loving family that nurtured her dreams and supported her ambitions with the kind of unwavering devotion that creates confident, capable young adults. From her earliest years, those who knew Brittany could see something special in her, a combination of intelligence, compassion, and determination that seemed to point toward a future filled with purpose and achievement. Even as a freshman in high school, Brittany had already set her sights on the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specifically drawn to the institution's reputation for excellence in preparing students for medical careers. This wasn't the casual interest of a teenager exploring options. This was the focused determination of someone who had found her calling and was willing to work tirelessly to achieve it. The dream of becoming a physician wasn't just about professional success for Brittany. Those who knew her understood that her desire to enter medicine came from a deep well of empathy and a genuine desire to help others during their most vulnerable moments. She was the kind of person who was naturally drawn to healing, who saw suffering and felt compelled to do something about it. Her academic journey reflected this serious purpose. Brittany was a dedicated student who understood that the path to medical school required not just intelligence, but also discipline, persistence, and the ability to maintain excellence across multiple challenging subjects. She approached her studies with the kind of methodical determination that would serve her well in the demanding world of medicine. By the time she arrived at UW-Madison, Brittany had already begun to establish herself as someone who would make a difference in the world. She was pursuing her pre-medical studies with the kind of focus that impressed her professors and earned the respect of her fellow students. Her grades reflected her commitment, and her interactions with others revealed the compassionate nature that would have made her an exceptional physician. Brittany's life as a college student was marked by the kind of balance that successful people learn to maintain. She was serious about her studies, but she also understood the importance of building relationships and creating a life outside the classroom. She had formed meaningful friendships with classmates who shared her academic ambitions, and she had found love with Jordan Gonnering, her fiancé who shared her vision for the future. The relationship with Jordan represented everything that young love should be: supportive, encouraging, and built on shared dreams and mutual respect. They had found in each other not just romantic partners, but also companions for the journey toward their professional goals. Jordan understood the demands of Brittany's pre-medical studies and supported her dedication to her education. Their shared apartment on West Doty Street in downtown Madison was more than just a place to live, it was a sanctuary where they could build their relationship while pursuing their individual dreams. The apartment represented their first real step toward independence, their first attempt at creating a life together outside the protective embrace of their families. Downtown Madison was the perfect setting for ambitious young students like Brittany and Jordan. The area was vibrant with student life, close enough to campus to make daily commutes manageable, but far enough away to feel like they were truly living on their own. The neighborhood was generally considered safe, the kind of place where students could focus on their studies without worrying about their personal security. For Brittany, the apartment on West Doty Street was a place where she could concentrate on her studies, spend time with Jordan, and prepare for the next phase of her academic journey. She had created a space that reflected her personality and her priorities: organized, comfortable, and conducive to the kind of serious study that medical school preparation required. The spring of 2008 found Brittany deep in the midst of her junior year, navigating the challenging coursework that would determine her readiness for medical school applications. She was taking the kinds of classes that would test not just her intellectual abilities, but also her determination and her ability to handle pressure. These were the courses that would shape her understanding of the sciences that would form the foundation of her medical career. April 2, 2008, began like any other day in Brittany's carefully structured life. She had classes to attend, studying to do, and the ongoing preparation for exams that would play a crucial role in determining her future. It was a Wednesday, the middle of the week, the kind of day that often feels routine but is actually filled with the small moments that add up to create the texture of a life. That morning, Brittany had no way of knowing that this would be the last ordinary day of her life. She went through her normal routine, preparing for classes, gathering her materials, and heading out into the Madison morning with the same sense of purpose that had driven her throughout her academic career. The day would include time in the classroom, engaging with professors and classmates in the kind of intellectual discourse that she found energizing and inspiring. She would take notes, ask questions, and continue building the foundation of knowledge that would serve her throughout her medical career. It was the kind of day that represented everything she loved about her academic journey. As afternoon approached, Brittany made her way back to the apartment on West Doty Street, carrying with her the satisfaction of another productive day of learning and the anticipation of the studying that would fill her evening hours. She had no way of knowing that someone else was also making his way through the downtown Madison streets that day, someone whose presence would transform her ordinary afternoon into something unspeakably tragic. While Brittany Zimmerman was building a life dedicated to healing and helping others, David Allen Call was trapped in a very different kind of existence, one defined by addiction, violence, and a complete disregard for the rights and dignity of others. At 53 years old, Call had already accumulated a criminal history that painted a disturbing picture of a man who had chosen a path of destruction and harm. Call's story was one of squandered opportunities and escalating criminal behavior. He was a registered sex offender, a designation that carried with it the weight of previous victims and the recognition by the justice system that he posed a continuing threat to public safety. His criminal record included convictions for sexual assault, multiple drunk driving offenses, and a pattern of behavior that demonstrated his inability to function as a productive member of society. The weeks leading up to April 2, 2008, had been particularly difficult for Call. He had been living the kind of transient lifestyle that often accompanies serious drug addiction, moving from place to place, staying with acquaintances when possible, and surviving on the streets when necessary. His addiction to methamphetamine and crack cocaine had reached a level that was consuming every aspect of his existence. On the day that would change everything, Call had been awake for 8 consecutive days, his system flooded with the kind of stimulants that can push an already unstable mind beyond the boundaries of rational thought. The combination of sleep deprivation, drug intoxication, and his underlying propensity for violence had created a perfect storm of dangerous circumstances. Call's need for money to feed his drug habit had become desperate. He had been moving through the downtown Madison area, looking for opportunities to acquire cash through whatever means necessary. His history suggested that he was capable of violence, but his need for drugs had pushed him beyond his usual boundaries of criminal behavior. The neighborhood around West Doty Street was familiar to Call, an area where he had previously engaged in various criminal activities. He knew the layout of the streets, the patterns of residents, and the opportunities that might present themselves to someone looking to take advantage of others. The area's mix of student housing and residential properties made it an attractive target for someone seeking easy opportunities for theft or other crimes. What Call was looking for that day was simple: money for drugs, obtained through whatever means necessary. He had already proven his willingness to victimize others, and his desperation had reached a level where he was prepared to escalate his criminal behavior to whatever degree might be required to get what he needed. The method Call employed was one he had used before, a scam involving a fabricated story about needing money for car repairs. It was a simple con that played on people's natural sympathy and willingness to help someone in apparent distress. The story was designed to lower potential victims' guard and create an opportunity for Call to gain access to their homes or their money. As Call moved through the downtown Madison streets that afternoon, he was in a state of mind that was both desperate and dangerous. The combination of drugs, sleep deprivation, and his underlying criminal tendencies had created a situation where he was capable of violence at a moment's notice. He was looking for an opportunity, and he was prepared to take whatever he could get, regardless of the consequences for his victims. The randomness of what was about to happen cannot be overstated. Brittany Zimmerman had no connection to David Call, no reason to expect that their paths would cross, and no way of knowing that her routine afternoon was about to intersect with the chaotic, violent world that Call inhabited. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of circumstances completely beyond her control. Call's approach to the area around West Doty Street was methodical but opportunistic. He was looking for signs of vulnerability, for situations where he might be able to gain access to homes or to people who might be susceptible to his cons. The combination of student housing and the generally trusting nature of the academic community made the area attractive to someone with his predatory instincts. As the afternoon progressed, Call's desperation was mounting. He needed money for drugs, and he needed it quickly. His usual methods of obtaining cash weren't working, and his intoxicated state was making him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous. He was reaching a point where he was prepared to do whatever it took to get what he needed. The collision of these two worlds, Brittany's world of academic achievement and future promise, and Call's world of addiction and violence, was about to occur with devastating consequences. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives would intersect that day, but the randomness of the encounter would make the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Call's presence in the neighborhood was like a cancer moving through healthy tissue, bringing with it the potential for destruction and harm. His addiction had driven him to a point where he was capable of anything, and his criminal history suggested that he had no moral boundaries that would prevent him from victimizing innocent people. As Brittany was making her way home from class, focused on her studies and her future, Call was moving through the same streets with very different intentions. He was looking for an opportunity to take what he needed, regardless of the cost to others. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would destroy one life and forever alter the lives of everyone who loved Brittany Zimmerman. The spring afternoon of April 2, 2008, was the kind of day that makes living in Madison, Wisconsin, feel like a privilege. The weather was pleasant, the campus was alive with the energy of students preparing for the end of the semester, and there was a sense of optimism in the air that comes with the changing seasons and the promise of summer ahead. Brittany Zimmerman had spent the morning and early afternoon engaged in the kind of intellectual work that energized her and reinforced her commitment to her academic goals. She had attended classes, participated in discussions, and continued building the foundation of knowledge that would serve her throughout her medical career. It was exactly the kind of day that represented everything she loved about her life as a student. As the afternoon progressed, Brittany made her way back to the apartment she shared with Jordan on West Doty Street. The walk through downtown Madison was familiar and comfortable, a routine journey that she had made countless times before. The neighborhood felt safe and welcoming, the kind of place where students could focus on their studies without worrying about their personal security. The apartment on West Doty Street was more than just a place to live. It was a sanctuary where Brittany could concentrate on her studies, spend time with Jordan, and prepare for the next phase of her academic journey. She had worked hard to create a space that reflected her personality and her priorities, organized, comfortable, and conducive to the kind of serious study that medical school preparation required. When Brittany arrived at the apartment that afternoon, she was likely thinking about the studying she needed to do, the assignments that required her attention, and the ongoing preparation for exams that would play a crucial role in determining her future. It was the kind of focused mindset that had served her well throughout her academic career, the ability to maintain concentration on her goals despite the distractions and pressures of college life. What Brittany didn't know was that David Call had been moving through the downtown Madison area that same afternoon, his mind clouded by 8 days without sleep and a dangerous combination of methamphetamine and crack cocaine. His desperation for money to feed his drug habit had driven him to a point where he was prepared to do whatever it took to get what he needed. Call's method of operation was simple but effective. He would approach homes with a fabricated story about needing money for car repairs, playing on people's natural sympathy and willingness to help someone in apparent distress. It was a con that he had used before, and it was designed to lower potential victims' guard and create an opportunity for him to gain access to their homes or their money. The timing of what happened next was purely coincidental, the kind of random intersection of lives that can have devastating consequences. As Brittany was settling into her apartment, preparing for an afternoon of studying, Call was making his way through the neighborhood, looking for opportunities to execute his desperate plan for obtaining money. According to the evidence that would later be presented in court, Call forced his way into the apartment on West Doty Street through a door that he broke to gain entry. The violence of his entry should have been a warning to anyone inside that this was not a casual visit or a simple request for help. This was a forced entry by someone who was prepared to use violence to get what he wanted. Brittany was alone in the apartment when Call broke in. Jordan was not home, leaving her to face this terrifying situation by herself. The young woman who had dedicated her life to healing and helping others was suddenly confronted with the kind of violence and malice that she had probably never imagined she would encounter. The moments that followed were captured, in part, by a technology that was supposed to be Brittany's lifeline to safety. Realizing the danger she was in, Brittany managed to call 911 from her cell phone, desperately seeking help from the emergency services that were designed to protect people in exactly these kinds of situations. The 911 call began at 12:19 p.m., and what it captured was the sound of a young woman fighting for her life. The emergency dispatcher could hear Brittany screaming, the sounds of a struggle, and muffled voices that suggested she was being attacked. It was the kind of call that should have resulted in an immediate and overwhelming response from law enforcement. But what happened instead was one of the most tragic failures in the history of Madison's emergency response system. The 911 call was mishandled by the emergency dispatch center, resulting in a delay that would prove fatal. Despite the clear evidence of an emergency in progress, police officers were not immediately dispatched to the scene. During those crucial minutes, as Brittany fought for her life and help failed to arrive, Call was carrying out an attack that was both violent and methodical. According to his later confessions, he knocked the phone out of Brittany's hand as she was trying to call for help, then dragged her to the bedroom where he attempted to strangle her with a t-shirt. When the strangulation attempt didn't kill her, Call escalated his attack, using a kitchen knife to stab Brittany multiple times. The violence was extreme and deliberate, the actions of someone who was determined to kill regardless of his victim's desperate attempts to defend herself. Brittany fought back with everything she had. The evidence at the scene would later show that she had not given up without a struggle, that she had used every ounce of strength and determination she possessed to try to save her own life. The young woman who had planned to dedicate her life to healing others fought with remarkable courage against someone who was determined to destroy her. The attack was not motivated by sexual assault or personal animosity. According to Call's later confessions, he had broken into the apartment seeking money for drugs, and he had killed Brittany because she couldn't or wouldn't give him what he wanted. It was a senseless act of violence motivated by nothing more than his addiction and his complete disregard for human life. As Brittany's life ebbed away in her own apartment, the place that should have been her sanctuary, the 911 system that should have been her lifeline was failing her in the most fundamental way possible. The call for help that should have brought immediate assistance instead became evidence of a system that was not prepared to handle the kind of emergency that was unfolding. The tragedy of what happened in that apartment was compounded by the knowledge that help was supposed to be on the way, that there were people whose job it was to respond to calls for help, but that the system had failed at the most crucial moment. Brittany died alone, fighting for her life, while the help she had called for was delayed by human error and systemic failures. The 911 call that Brittany Zimmerman made on April 2, 2008, should have been her lifeline to safety. Instead, it became evidence of a system failure that would haunt the Madison community for years to come and raise fundamental questions about the reliability of emergency services when they are needed most. The call came in at 12:19 p.m., captured by the Dane County 911 Center's recording equipment. What the recording preserved was heartbreaking: the sound of a young woman screaming in terror, the muffled sounds of a violent struggle, and the desperate circumstances of someone fighting for her life. It was exactly the kind of emergency that the 911 system was designed to handle, the kind of call that should have triggered an immediate and overwhelming response from law enforcement. But what happened instead was a series of failures that would prove fatal. The emergency dispatcher who received the call made a critical error in judgment, treating the call as a disconnect rather than recognizing it as an emergency in progress. The dispatcher heard the screaming and the sounds of struggle, but failed to immediately dispatch officers to the scene. According to the investigation that followed, the dispatcher believed that the call might have been accidental, perhaps a but dial or a mistaken call that had captured background noise rather than a genuine emergency. This interpretation, which proved to be tragically wrong, resulted in a delay that gave David Call the time he needed to complete his violent attack on Brittany. The failure to immediately dispatch officers to the scene was not just a mistake, it was a breakdown of the fundamental promise that emergency services make to the public. When someone calls 911, they are supposed to receive immediate assistance. The system is designed to err on the side of caution, to respond to potential emergencies as if they are real emergencies, because the cost of being wrong is measured in human lives. In Brittany's case, the cost of the system's failure was the highest possible price. While she was fighting for her life in her apartment, desperately trying to defend herself against Call's violent attack, the help she had called for was being delayed by a system that had failed to recognize the urgency of her situation. The 911 recording would later be analyzed by experts who confirmed that the sounds captured on the tape were consistent with a violent assault in progress. The screaming was clearly audible, the sounds of struggle were unmistakable, and the circumstances should have left no doubt that someone was in immediate danger. The failure to recognize these signs represented a breakdown in training, protocol, or judgment that had fatal consequences. When police officers finally arrived at the apartment on West Doty Street, they found a scene of devastating violence. Brittany Zimmerman was dead, the victim of a brutal attack that had included both strangulation and multiple stab wounds. The young woman who had called for help had died alone, her cries for assistance having failed to bring the rescue that should have been her right as a citizen. The scene that officers encountered was so violent that some initially believed Brittany had been shot. The level of trauma was extreme, the evidence of a prolonged and vicious attack that had continued until the victim was dead. It was the kind of crime scene that would haunt the investigators who processed it and the officers who responded to it. The delay in the emergency response was later determined to be 48 minutes during which Brittany's life hung in the balance, 48 minutes during which the system that was supposed to protect her failed to function as designed. By the time officers arrived, Call was long gone, having completed his attack and fled the scene. The failure of the 911 system in Brittany's case was not just a technical malfunction or an isolated incident. It represented a breakdown in the human judgment and decision-making processes that are supposed to ensure that emergency calls receive appropriate responses. The dispatcher's failure to recognize the urgency of the situation was a human error with fatal consequences. The investigation into the 911 system's failure revealed several contributing factors. Training protocols may have been inadequate, the dispatcher may have been overwhelmed by call volume, or there may have been systemic issues with how emergency calls were prioritized and processed. Whatever the specific causes, the result was a breakdown in the safety net that citizens depend on for protection. The impact of this failure extended far beyond Brittany's case. The knowledge that the 911 system had failed to protect someone who had followed all the rules, who had called for help, who had tried to do everything right, created a crisis of confidence in the emergency response system. Citizens began to question whether they could depend on the system to protect them in their moments of greatest need. The failure also raised questions about accountability and reform. If the system could fail so catastrophically in Brittany's case, what was being done to ensure that similar failures wouldn't happen again? What changes were being made to prevent other victims from experiencing the same abandonment in their moments of greatest need? For Brittany's family, the knowledge that help had been called for but had failed to arrive added an additional layer of tragedy to their loss. They had to live with the knowledge that their daughter had done everything she could to save herself, that she had reached out for help through the proper channels, but that the system had failed her at the most crucial moment. The 911 recording became evidence not just of Brittany's final moments, but of a system that had broken down when it was needed most. The sounds of her terror and her struggle would serve as a reminder of what was at stake when emergency services failed to function as designed. Her death was not just the result of a random act of violence, it was also the result of a system that had failed to fulfill its most basic promise to protect the citizens who depended on it. The discovery of Brittany Zimmerman's body on April 2, 2008, launched one of the most intensive investigations in Madison Police Department history. The brutal nature of the crime, combined with the failure of the 911 system and the apparent randomness of the attack, created a case that would challenge investigators and capture the attention of the entire community. The crime scene at the West Doty Street apartment told a story of violence and terror that was difficult for even experienced investigators to process. Brittany had been found strangled and stabbed to death in her own home, the victim of an attack that appeared to be both random and extremely violent. The evidence suggested that she had fought back with everything she had, but that her attacker had been determined to kill regardless of her resistance. Detective Marion Morgan, who would become the lead investigator on the case, arrived at the scene to find evidence of a forced entry and a struggle that had moved throughout the apartment. The door had been broken to gain entry, suggesting that the attack was not the result of someone Brittany had willingly let into her home. This was a stranger who had forced his way in with violent intentions. The forensic evidence collected at the scene would prove crucial to the eventual resolution of the case, though it would take years for technology and circumstances to align in a way that would allow investigators to make use of it. DNA evidence was collected from multiple locations throughout the apartment, including samples that would later be matched to David Cull. The investigation revealed that Brittany had been alone in the apartment when the attack occurred. Jordan Gonnering, her fiancé, was not home at the time, leaving her to face the attacker by herself. The knowledge that she had been isolated and vulnerable made the crime even more tragic and highlighted the random nature of the violence that had taken her life. Investigators immediately began canvassing the neighborhood, looking for witnesses who might have seen or heard something unusual around the time of the attack. The downtown Madison area was generally busy with student activity, and there was hope that someone might have noticed suspicious behavior or seen the attacker fleeing the scene. The canvass revealed that several neighbors had heard unusual sounds around the time of the attack, but none had immediately recognized them as signs of violence or distress. The sounds of the struggle had been muffled by the walls of the apartment, and the busy nature of the neighborhood meant that unusual noises were not necessarily cause for immediate concern. One of the most significant developments in the early investigation was the discovery that someone had been going door to door in the neighborhood around the time of the attack, using a fabricated story about needing money for car repairs. Several residents reported being approached by a man who claimed to have car trouble and needed cash for repairs. The man was described as appearing to be under the influence of drugs and behaving erratically. This pattern of behavior was significant because it suggested that the attack on Brittany was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of criminal activity in the neighborhood. The fact that the man was specifically seeking money also provided a potential motive for the attack, robbery or burglary that had escalated to violence when the victim couldn't or wouldn't comply with the attacker's demands. The investigation expanded to include a search for this mysterious figure who had been canvassing the neighborhood. Police issued public appeals for information about anyone who had been approached by someone seeking money for car repairs, and they began building a profile of the suspect based on the descriptions provided by witnesses. The forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed additional details about the nature of the attack. The evidence suggested that Brittany had been strangled with a piece of clothing, likely a t-shirt, and then stabbed multiple times with a kitchen knife. The violence was extreme and appeared to be the work of someone who was either under the influence of drugs or suffering from some form of mental illness. The investigation also focused on the 911 call that Brittany had made during the attack. The recording was analyzed by experts who confirmed that the sounds captured were consistent with a violent assault in progress. The failure of the emergency dispatch system to respond appropriately to the call became a separate but related investigation that would have implications for how emergency services operated in the future. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was not a crime of passion or a domestic violence incident. The evidence suggested that Brittany had been killed by a stranger, someone who had broken into her apartment with criminal intent and had escalated to murder when his plans were frustrated. This made the case even more challenging for investigators, as they had to search for a suspect who had no known connection to the victim. The random nature of the crime also made it more terrifying for the community. If Brittany could be killed in her own apartment by a complete stranger, then no one was truly safe. The attack highlighted the vulnerability that all citizens face to random acts of violence, and it created a sense of unease that would persist until the perpetrator was caught. Investigators began looking at similar crimes in the area, searching for patterns that might connect Brittany's murder to other incidents. They examined unsolved burglaries, assaults, and other violent crimes, looking for evidence that the same person might have been responsible for multiple incidents. The investigation also included a detailed analysis of Brittany's life, not because she was suspected of any wrongdoing, but because investigators needed to understand whether there might have been any connection between her and her attacker. The analysis confirmed what everyone who knew her already understood: she was an innocent victim of random violence, a young woman who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when a dangerous criminal was looking for victims. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued but without a clear breakthrough. The evidence was solid, but it hadn't yet pointed investigators toward a specific suspect. The case would require patience, persistence, and eventually, advances in forensic technology that would allow investigators to make connections that weren't possible in 2008. As the initial intensity of the investigation into Brittany Zimmerman's murder began to fade, her family faced the devastating reality that their daughter's killer remained free. The case that had captured the attention of the entire Madison community was becoming what law enforcement officials euphemistically call a cold case, an investigation that had exhausted its immediate leads and was now dependent on new evidence, technological advances, or fortunate breaks to move forward. For Kevin and Jean Zimmerman, Brittany's parents, the transition from active investigation to cold case status was heartbreaking. They had cooperated fully with investigators, provided every piece of information they could think of, and maintained hope that their daughter's killer would quickly be brought to justice. The realization that months were turning into years without an arrest was almost unbearable. The Zimmerman family's response to this challenge was characteristic of their daughter's own determination and strength. Rather than retreating into private grief, they became advocates for justice, working tirelessly to keep Brittany's case in the public eye and to ensure that investigators never forgot about their daughter or the urgency of finding her killer. Kevin Zimmerman, in particular, became a powerful voice for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. His daughter's case had exposed failures in the 911 system that had contributed to her death, and he was determined that these failures would not be repeated. He worked with legislators, law enforcement officials, and community leaders to push for reforms that would prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. The family's advocacy efforts included regular media appearances, community presentations, and meetings with law enforcement officials. They wanted to ensure that Brittany's case remained a priority, that resources continued to be allocated to the investigation, and that the public remained aware of the ongoing search for her killer. Jean Zimmerman's grief was expressed through a different but equally powerful form of advocacy. She worked to honor her daughter's memory by supporting the causes that Brittany had cared about, including medical education and healthcare access. The family established scholarships and other programs that would help other young people pursue the same dreams that Brittany had been chasing when her life was cut short. The cold case years were marked by periodic developments that raised hopes but didn't lead to arrests. Investigators would occasionally receive tips that seemed promising, or advances in forensic technology would allow them to reanalyze evidence in new ways. Each of these developments brought renewed hope, but also the disappointment of leads that didn't pan out. One of the most frustrating aspects of the cold case period was the knowledge that Brittany's killer was still out there, potentially committing other crimes and endangering other innocent people. The randomness of Brittany's murder meant that her killer was likely someone who posed a continuing threat to public safety, but without identifying him, there was no way to prevent him from striking again. The Madison Police Department, to their credit, never officially closed the case. Detective Marion Morgan and other investigators continued to work on it, following up on tips, reanalyzing evidence, and looking for new approaches that might yield results. The department understood that the community was watching and that the family deserved to see their daughter's killer brought to justice. Advances in DNA technology during the cold case years offered new hope for solving Brittany's murder. The forensic evidence collected at the crime scene included samples from the crime scene that had been preserved but couldn't be fully analyzed with the technology available in 2008. As DNA analysis became more sophisticated and databases expanded, there was hope that the evidence might eventually lead to a match with a known offender. The family also had to navigate the complex emotions that come with prolonged grief and uncertainty. The anniversary of Brittany's death became an annual reminder of their loss, but also an opportunity to renew their commitment to finding justice. Each year brought a mixture of pain and determination, as they honored their daughter's memory while continuing to push for resolution of her case. Community support remained strong throughout the cold case years, though it naturally fluctuated as other events captured public attention. The University of Wisconsin-Madison community, in particular, maintained its connection to Brittany's story, with students and faculty organizing memorial events and advocacy efforts that kept her case visible. The impact of Brittany's murder on the broader community extended beyond the immediate search for her killer. Her case had highlighted vulnerabilities in emergency response systems, campus safety protocols, and the general security measures that were supposed to protect students and residents. These broader implications ensured that her case remained relevant to ongoing discussions about public safety and criminal justice reform. After more than a decade of investigation, the breakthrough in Brittany Zimmerman's case came not from a dramatic revelation or a surprise confession, but from the patient application of advancing forensic technology combined with the persistence of investigators who had never given up on finding her killer. In 2020, 12 years after Brittany's murder, advances in DNA analysis finally provided the connection that investigators had been seeking. The genetic material collected from the crime scene was analyzed using techniques that hadn't been available in 2008, and the results were entered into expanded databases that included a much larger pool of potential matches. The DNA evidence pointed to David Alan Call, the same man who had been canvassing the West Doty Street neighborhood on the day of the murder, seeking money with his fabricated story about car repairs. The genetic evidence confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that Brittany's killer was the same person who had been going door to door in the area, looking for opportunities to commit crimes. When investigators located Call in 2020, they found a man whose life had continued on the same destructive trajectory that had led him to Brittany's apartment 12 years earlier. He was still struggling with drug addiction, still accumulating criminal charges, and still living the kind of transient lifestyle that had characterized his existence for decades. The arrest of David Call in connection with Brittany's murder was the moment that her family had been waiting for since April 2, 2008. After 12 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers about who had killed their daughter and why. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that no arrest could bring Brittany back or undo the years of grief and uncertainty they had endured. Call's arrest also provided closure for the investigators who had worked on the case for more than a decade. Detective Marion Morgan and her colleagues had never stopped believing that the case could be solved, and the DNA match vindicated their persistence and their faith in the power of forensic science to eventually provide answers. The charges against Call were comprehensive, reflecting the brutal nature of the crime and the strength of the evidence against him. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, burglary, and other related offenses that carried the possibility of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal proceedings that followed Call's arrest were complicated by the passage of time and his own deteriorating mental and physical condition. His years of drug abuse had taken a significant toll on his health and his cognitive abilities, raising questions about his competency to stand trial and his ability to assist in his own defense. The legal proceedings in the case of David Alan Call began with questions about his mental competency to stand trial. Years of methamphetamine and crack cocaine abuse had severely damaged his cognitive functions, and court-appointed psychiatrists needed to evaluate whether he could understand the charges against him and assist in his own defense. After extensive evaluation, Call was determined to be competent to stand trial, clearing the way for the prosecution to present their case. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the DNA match, witness testimony about his presence in the neighborhood, and the pattern of behavior that connected him to the crime. However, before the case could go to trial, Call's defense attorneys engaged in plea negotiations with prosecutors. The strength of the evidence against their client made a conviction virtually certain, and the brutality of the crime meant that he was likely facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a development that provided some measure of closure for Brittany's family, Call eventually agreed to plead guilty to the charges against him. As part of his plea agreement, he provided a detailed confession that finally answered the questions that had haunted investigators and the Zimmerman family for more than a decade. Call's confession confirmed the details that investigators had pieced together from the evidence. He admitted that he had been going door to door in the neighborhood, using his fabricated story about needing money for car repairs. When he approached Brittany's apartment, he had forced his way inside with the intention of robbing her to get money for drugs. According to his confession, Call had not intended to kill Brittany when he broke into her apartment. His plan was to take whatever money or valuables he could find and leave. However, when Brittany called 911 for help, he panicked and knocked the phone out of her hand. The situation then escalated into violence that ultimately resulted in her death. Call admitted to dragging Brittany to the bedroom and attempting to strangle her with a t-shirt. When that method didn't kill her quickly enough, he obtained a kitchen knife and stabbed her multiple times until she died. His confession revealed the cold, methodical nature of the attack and his complete disregard for Brittany's life. The confession also provided insight into Call's state of mind at the time of the murder. He admitted that he had been awake for 8 consecutive days, using methamphetamine and crack cocaine continuously. His addiction had reached a level where he was prepared to do anything to get money for drugs, including killing an innocent young woman who had never done anything to harm him. For the Zimmerman family, hearing the details of their daughter's final moments was both devastating and necessary. They finally had complete answers about what had happened to Brittany, even though those answers confirmed their worst fears about the terror and pain she had experienced. The plea agreement resulted in Call being sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime and ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. For a man who was already in his 60s and in poor health due to decades of drug abuse, the sentence was effectively a death sentence. The resolution of Brittany Zimmerman's murder case brought a sense of closure to her family and the Madison community, but it also highlighted the broader lessons that could be learned from her tragic death and the long journey to justice that followed. One of the most significant outcomes of Brittany's case was the reform of emergency dispatch procedures that resulted from the failure of the 911 system to respond appropriately to her call for help. The 48-minute delay in dispatching officers to her apartment had been a contributing factor in her death, and her family's advocacy efforts helped bring about changes that would prevent similar failures in the future. The reforms included improved training for emergency dispatchers, better protocols for handling calls where the nature of the emergency was unclear, and technological upgrades that made it easier for dispatchers to recognize and respond to calls involving violence or distress. These changes represented a living memorial to Brittany, ensuring that her death would help prevent similar tragedies. The case also highlighted the importance of persistent investigation and the value of maintaining hope even when cases seem unsolvable. The investigators who worked on Brittany's case for more than a decade demonstrated the kind of dedication and professionalism that the public deserves from law enforcement. Their refusal to give up eventually led to justice for Brittany and her family. The role of advancing forensic technology in solving the case provided hope for other families dealing with unsolved murders. Brittany's case demonstrated that evidence preserved from crime scenes could eventually yield results, even years or decades later, as analytical techniques improved and databases expanded. For the Zimmerman family, the resolution of their daughter's case allowed them to focus more fully on honoring her memory and supporting the causes she had cared about. They continued their advocacy work, but with the knowledge that justice had finally been served and that their daughter's killer would never harm anyone else. The medical scholarships and educational programs established in Brittany's name continued to help other young people pursue the same dreams that she had been chasing when her life was cut short. These programs represented the positive legacy that emerged from tragedy, ensuring that Brittany's commitment to healing and helping others would continue through the achievements of future physicians and healthcare workers. The University of Wisconsin-Madison community also found ways to honor Brittany's memory while learning from the circumstances of her death. Campus safety programs were enhanced, and students were educated about personal security measures that could help them avoid becoming victims of random violence. As we conclude this story, we remember Brittany Zimmerman not primarily as a victim of violence, but as a young woman who embodied the best qualities of her generation: intelligence, compassion, determination, and a commitment to making the world a better place through her chosen profession of medicine. Her death was a tragedy that could not be undone, but the response to that tragedy, the persistence of investigators, the advocacy of her family, the support of her community, and the reforms that emerged from the failures that contributed to her death, demonstrated the power of love, determination, and the pursuit of justice to create positive change even in the face of devastating loss. Brittany's story reminds us that every life has value, that justice may be delayed but should never be abandoned, and that the memories of those we lose can continue to inspire positive change long after they are gone. In honoring her memory, we commit ourselves to creating a world where young people like Brittany can pursue their dreams safely, where emergency systems function as they should, and where justice eventually prevails over the forces of violence and destruction. Rest in peace, Brittany Sue Zimmerman. Your dreams of healing others live on through those who were inspired by your story and those who continue to benefit from the positive changes that emerged from your tragic death. You are not forgotten, and your legacy continues to make a difference in the world you so desperately wanted to help heal. To my great listeners, thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.